Beneath the dense canopy of the Amazon, where sunlight rarely touches the forest floor and rivers wind like liquid shadows, human footsteps have left only fleeting traces. Across these remote expanses, explorers have encountered vanished camps, enigmatic villages, and strange phenomena that defy explanation, from untraceable mist that moves against the wind to whispers of structures that seem to rebuild themselves. Together, we will follow the expeditions through the forest's hidden geometries and silent echoes, tracing the uncharted rhythms of wildlife, uncovering meticulous evidence, faint signs of human presence erased or altered, and mysteries that linger in the shadows of trees taller than any city tower. With every step, the Amazon's untamed secrets reveal themselves, drawing us deeper into places where nature and enigma intertwine, and each discovery only deepens the mystery. The Erased 19 Days. Heavy vapour drifted among the dark trunks as the rainforest exhaled its nightly warmth, and it was within this shifting world that an ecological reconnaissance team, mentioned only briefly in a handful of late 1980s regional reports, reappeared along the upper Rio Negro with a calm that unsettled those waiting for them. The group had departed from a staging point near São Gabriel da Cachoeira to conduct an informal survey of riparian forest composition, following a route commonly used by researchers studying Várzea floodplain systems. Yet, when they returned, they carried a silence that suggested something had folded itself over their memories, leaving the shape of their journey intact but the content strangely hollow. Unsettled officials attempted to reconstruct the timeline using the surviving field logs, and what they found offered little comfort. The notebooks recorded daily ecological measurements, canopy height estimates, humidity readings consistent with the region's typical 80 to 90%, and brief notes on bird calls commonly identified in the Rio Negro basin, such as those of the crimson topaz and the curl-crested araucari, yet none of the entries contained handwriting that any member of the team recognised as their own. The script was orderly, almost neat to the point of impersonality, and the phrasing lacked the idiosyncrasies normally present in field notes, creating the unnerving impression that the records had been generated by someone following a template intended to resemble a survey rather than by observers genuinely immersed in the forest. Attempts to retrace the group's path were hampered by the dense patchwork of Igapo forest that lined the tributaries they reportedly followed, regions where black water rivers flow quietly under the shade of rubber trees and buriti palms, muffling sound and sense alike beneath their flooded roots. It was as if the team had travelled through the landscape with complete control, marking each campsite with the same methodical arrangement of cooking gear and storage crates described in their logs. Yet every one of those campsites, preserved only as impressions in damp soil and clipped vegetation, felt curiously devoid of human presence, as though whoever had occupied them had left before fully settling into the act of living. Along several stretches of the route, investigators noted indigenous trails used historically by groups such as the Yanomami and Banua, pathways known for their precision and orientation even under dense canopy cover. These trails, typically lined by subtle blaze marks or foot-worn routes, had been crossed repeatedly by the expedition, yet no mention of them appeared in the notebooks, although such features are normally documented in any ecological survey for geographic reference. The forest, in its vast continuity, seemed to conceal an intentional absence woven through the group's progress. Rumours arose among those familiar with the region who suggested that environmental conditions alone might explain the memory loss. The Rio Negro Basin's dense canopy limits ultraviolet light, creating extended twilight beneath the leaves where circadian rhythms can easily drift. And the humid, low-oxygen microclimate of flooded forests is known to cause lethargy and disorientation in unacclimated visitors. The absence of physiological disturbance only deepened the enigma, as natural explanations dissolved under evidence that their bodies had endured the forest normally while their minds had not. One investigator focused on the navigational charts, many marked with precise coordinates corresponding to tributaries of the Rio Negro, including stretches near the Curicuriari and the Araraquara. These charts contained thin pencil lines tracking movements that matched known river contours with uncanny accuracy, leading some to wonder whether the team had relied on a form of orientation not entirely their own. The accuracy was so exact that hydrologists noted the lines corresponded even to minor bends caused by seasonal water level fluctuations, details difficult to map without consciously observing them. Yet the team members, when questioned, expressed disbelief at their own recordings, insisting they could not remember tracing even a single line. Their collective confusion was so uniform it resembled the aftermath of a shared dream erased upon waking. As interviews progressed, a strange pattern emerged. Each member recalled clearly the first 3 days of the journey, describing the familiar routine of moving between camp and survey points, identifying common understory plants such as acai palms and philodendron tangles, and cataloguing the calls of nightjars echoing across the water. Then, without warning, recollections collapsed into a blank that none could overcome, even when prompted with environmental cues. It was as though a curtain had descended over the landscape at a precise moment, removing not only their perceptions, but also the sense of time passing. Those 19 days did not feel absent to them. They felt as if they had never existed. The final pages of the notebooks provided the only hint that something unusual had occurred. On the last morning before their return, the writer, whatever that may have been, described hearing a low, continuous vibration rising from the ground, a sound too regular to be an animal call and too soft to echo through the trees. The entry mentioned the canopy trembling slightly, though no wind was present, and a faint metallic taste settling in the air just before dawn. The handwriting then shifted once more into that calm, smooth script, ending with a line that simply read, "We should move now." What the writer believed they were moving toward or away from remains unknowable. The team's memories did not return. Their accounts remained consistent in their emptiness, and the forest along the upper Rio Negro resumed its silent, indifferent life, holding whatever truth those 19 days contained. The logs offered no answers, the investigators found no traces, and the river carried away the faintest suggestion that someone, or something, had passed through the rainforest with them and left nothing but silence in its wake. The vanishing river path. Soft morning light drifted across the floodplain as the expedition pushed its canoes toward a river whose course had been charted by generations of surveyors. The team, still recovering from the unease surrounding their earlier disappearance, had agreed to continue their work along the upper reaches of the Rio Madeira, trusting that familiar waters might offer steadier ground than the memories they had yet to reconstruct. By the time they entered the shadowed corridor of the first narrowing channel, the path they sought already seemed to drift somewhere just out of reach. Farther along the current, the water's surface began to widen in a way that suggested a familiar channel, yet its alignment felt subtly wrong. What should have been a direct southeast flow instead curved inward, as if the river had folded upon itself without leaving evidence of erosion or altered sediment patterns. Even the coloration of the water began to puzzle them, its tones shifting between the light brown sediment expected from upstream flows and the darker hue more typical of tributaries originating from distant forested wetlands. The river behaved as though it remembered a different route than the one the expedition carried in their charts. Spread across a waterproof tarp, the maps and instruments offered a confident geometry that the surrounding riverbanks quietly refused to match. The team paused near a sandbar formed by recent seasonal floods, laying out depth sounders, compasses, and printed hydrographic sheets that detailed every meander documented in the last 5 decades. Yet the reality around them contradicted every line on the paper, eliminating landmarks that should have been visible and presenting bends that had no precedent in surveyed data. The river here was part of an anabranching system known to split and rejoin in unpredictable ways, but even that natural phenomenon could not account for the complete absence of marked islands that once existed in abundance. What they faced was not a river subtly altered, but a river seemingly rewritten. Stories gathered from earlier river pilots and archived hydrographic notes hinted that this stretch of the Amazon had long unsettled those who tried to measure it. Decades-old accounts from riverine communities living along the Madeira spoke quietly of channels that appeared only briefly during certain water levels, before vanishing with no trace, leaving even experienced pilots unsure of where the current would lead them next. These stories were always framed as ecological caution rather than folklore, their purpose rooted in understanding a system too broad and dynamic for certainty. Now, as the expedition drifted deeper into this disputed corridor, those accounts began to carry a weight more substantial than anecdote. As the sun dipped behind a wall of canopy, The river's voice shifted to a low murmur that made every orientation cue feel strangely untrustworthy. The forest thickened to a point where even the direction of prevailing winds became impossible to discern, bringing with it a blend of scents that suggested both upstream wetlands and distant oxbow lakes. Navigators accustomed to reading the angle of light found themselves unable to judge how far they had travelled or how much the river had deviated from the expected course. They paddled forward with caution, unsure whether they moved along a new tributary or a portion of the main river reshaped by forces they could not quantify. Every stroke felt compelled by necessity rather than direction, as though the river itself had taken responsibility for guiding them. A sudden break in the tree line revealed the mouth of the tributary they had been seeking, appearing with such clarity that no one questioned it until the shape began to dissolve. The entrance was marked by the expected narrowing of water, the subtle drop in turbidity, and the presence of reeds that typically grew near stable, shallow banks. For a moment the team felt a surge of relief, believing they had finally realigned with the mapped route that had eluded them for most of the day. But as they approached, the tributary's form blurred into fragments of shadow and water, the once straight edge of the bank collapsing into drifting vegetation that floated apart without revealing what had held it together. Sediment plumes rose from beneath the surface, clouding the water with particles fine enough to suggest that the riverbed had been disturbed recently, though no storm or upstream event could explain the timing. Without fully realizing it, the team drifted into a void where the tributary should have been, their canoes gliding through a space shaped only by absence. By the time the team agreed to pull back towards steadier waters, their notebooks held descriptions that blended precise hydrology with a quiet trace of disbelief. They recorded every observable pattern with discipline: water depth, sediment texture, bank composition, flow rate, temperature variations, and the locations where expected landmarks failed to appear. Yet beneath each entry lay a subtle admission that their measurements could not reconcile the river they travelled with the river they knew. The tributary they pursued had left neither a channel nor a memory of its former path, and the waters behind them seemed to shift once more as they prepared to return upstream. Even retracing their route felt like moving through an unfamiliar corridor, as though the river had reshaped itself in their absence and presented a different face with each hour. They paddled in silence, recognizing that the unanswered questions of this place would follow them long after they reached familiar ground. Somewhere beyond the turning of the unseen channel, the river keeps rearranging its path in ways that seem intent on avoiding those who try to follow it. The camp that rebuilt itself. The moment the expedition stepped back into the clearing where they had established their original camp, a quiet unease settled over them, as if the forest were presenting a memory they were never meant to revisit. They recognized the shape of the clearing, the familiar angle of the riverbank, and the same cluster of towering ceiba trees whose buttress roots wrapped the earth like ancient ribs, yet the camp itself seemed touched by a logic that did not belong to them. According to their field logs, this site had been abandoned abruptly when their navigation equipment inexplicably failed, and the team pushed deeper inland, unaware of how long they would be gone. What they saw now did not match the memory of a hurried departure, but instead mirrored the strange order of a space tended by unseen hands. Just beyond the first ring of trampled undergrowth, freshly sliced stems and sap-bleeding branches hinted at a presence that had moved through the area far more recently than the team's abandoned timeline allowed. In Amazonian humidity, machete cuts develop a telltale darkening as the exposed plant tissue oxidizes, yet the wounds before them remained pale and moist, suggesting hours rather than weeks. The forest displayed disturbances that should have been impossible, and the unsettling thought grew that someone had been maintaining the perimeter with the same efficiency the team once relied on to keep their surroundings navigable. Each new observation contradicted the documented gap in their presence, leaving them to question whether something else had assumed stewardship of the clearing during their absence. Across the leaf-littered soil, the ground displayed a pattern of impressions and shifted debris that defied the usual rainforest rhythms of decay and insect takeover. Within 24 hours, ants, beetles and termites typically reclaim any disturbed surface, breaking down tracks and footprints until only subtle indentations remain. Yet here, the soil retained crisp outlines of pressure points, as though no time had passed at all. The distribution made no sense. They were too widely spaced to belong to any single person and followed no coherent path. Even the fungal bloom common around disturbed roots was absent. It was as though the forest had paused its usual decomposition cycle, leaving behind signs that were both familiar and inexplicably precise. Closer to the tree line, the hammock frames stood in an arrangement so precise and recently maintained that the team paused in silence, studying knots and lashings they had no memory of tying. Here, however, the knots bore a uniformity none of them recognised. The tension across the ridgelines was exact, the spacing between hammocks measured in even intervals that matched neither their training nor their recorded photographs from before they left. More unsettling still was the condition of the cordage. Fibres should have frayed in the humidity, yet the strands looked recently tightened, free of mould and perfectly angled toward the trees used as anchor points. The camp had been assembled with intention, but not with human memory. Near the supply area, gear lay sorted into deliberate clusters, with dry bags, machetes and cooking pots positioned as if someone had been attempting to restore order, according to a logic none of the researchers shared. Standard Amazon protocols require keeping food and gear suspended to avoid moisture, insects and opportunistic mammals, but here the equipment had been placed directly on flattened patches of earth, arranged by type rather than function. Dry bags, which the team always rolled in specific sequences to ensure waterproof integrity, were sealed in a methodical pattern none of them used. GPS devices lay aligned in a straight line even though their batteries had long since drained, and the units had somehow avoided the condensation that ordinarily seeps into screens left in humid air. Several notebooks, once water-stained and wrinkled from earlier storms, appeared flattened and stacked, their pages unexpectedly unwarped. The more they inspected, the more it felt like the camp had been curated rather than occupied. At the centre of the camp, the fire pit revealed pale ash and half-burned fragments whose colour and moisture suggested a recent tending at odds with the expedition's documented absence. In rainforest environments, fire ash quickly absorbs ambient humidity, darkening within a day and crumbling into clumps beneath the weight of moisture. Yet the ash here retained a light, almost flaky texture, indicating combustion within the last several hours. Charcoal pieces still held sharp edges instead of the softened contour that comes with slow saturation. Even remnants of manioc peel, the team's last prepared meal before abandoning the camp, were partially charred but not decomposed, a contradiction in a region where organic material vanishes quickly under the work of insects and microbes. The fire pit should have been a damp circle of collapsed charcoal and encroaching plant matter, not a recently maintained hearth. Something had preserved the site rather than allowed it to fade. What unsettled them most emerged only after a more thorough inspection, when a set of carefully coiled ropes and freshly cleaned metal tools indicated a level of attention to detail that felt almost intentional in its quiet precision. Ropes that had once been frayed from hauling equipment through flooded terrain were now smoothed, recoiled to uniform diameters, and stacked neatly atop a tarp that no longer bore the dirt streaks it had carried before. A machete blade that had rusted from river crossings glinted as though it had been scrubbed clean, yet no abrasions suggested sharpening or scraping. Even the compass case, scratched from earlier travel, appeared wiped of particulate matter despite the team remembering its worn condition. These were not signs of random disturbance or looting, they were signs of caretaking. The clearing felt like a place prepared for them but not by them, a space held in suspension as though awaiting their inevitable return. Long after they left the site behind, the sensation remained that whatever had maintained the camp had been waiting for their return rather than their departure. The phantom village of the Purus. The 1988 Tapajos survey expedition, navigating the winding Purus River, first glimpsed the shadowed outline of stilted structures that seemed to float above the seasonal floodplain like echoes of a forgotten past. The expedition had been charting riverine communities and documenting their remaining traces when the unexpected sight of a fully formed village caught them off guard. From the river, the poles and thatched rooftops appeared undisturbed, though the surrounding forest pressed close with dense growth, leaving the impression that the settlement had been untouched for decades, or perhaps longer. Even before stepping ashore, the team noticed the faint rhythmic sounds of water lapping against stilts and the subtle shift of leaves, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Maps and satellite imagery they had consulted beforehand indicated only scattered dwellings along this tributary, making the clarity and scale of what lay ahead a first mystery. Along the riverbank, narrow walkways of packed earth and remnants of wooden planks led towards stilts that bore the weight of collapsed or partially intact dwellings, revealing patterns of settlement adapted to the Amazon's fluctuating waters. The team observed how seasonal flooding had shaped the placement of each structure. Homes were raised well above the high water mark, and small wooden platforms connected them, providing movement even during an inundation. Historical surveys of Puris villages confirm these patterns. Anthropologists have noted that palafitos allow for seasonal fishing and protection against predators, both animal and environmental. Yet these walkways displayed an orderliness that belied the decades of abandonment the team assumed would have caused at least partial collapse. Broken boards had been set straight, and vegetation had been trimmed away from the paths in ways that left the earth smooth and level, as though someone had walked the routes recently. In the village's heart, the team found longhouses with pole and thatch frameworks still remarkably straight, their elevated floors supported by posts set deep into compacted soil, suggesting careful construction even amid the forest's reclaiming forces. Each post bore the dark patina of age, yet none were cracked or bowed, and the thatch roofing, though weathered, had not collapsed entirely under the weight of seasonal rains. Anthropological records of the region describe communal longhouses measuring up to 50 metres, divided internally by low partitions, serving as centres for food processing and social gatherings. In contrast to the expected decay, these structures preserved a semblance of their original form, their geometry precise, their interiors cleared of the detritus that the Amazon quickly deposits in abandoned spaces. The juxtaposition of preservation and abandonment unsettled the team, who were used to seeing the forest overtake even actively maintained research plots in a matter of months. Even among the weathered rooftops and moss-covered planks, subtle indicators suggested someone or something had maintained order. Footpaths were swept clear, fishing traps aligned along the tributary's edge, and small fire pits contained faint heat traces unaccounted for in the expedition's prior logs. Fish weirs, commonly used to channel seasonal migrations, had been positioned with deliberate spacing, and the surrounding ground bore impressions consistent with regular movement rather than random decay. Typically, the Amazon reclaims such installations swiftly. Within days, rising waters and terrestrial fauna dismantle what humans leave behind. Yet here, signs of recent activity contrasted starkly with the evidence of long-term abandonment. Footprints that faded unnaturally at the edge of the village, small piles of riverine debris stacked in orderly lines, and ash lightly scattered across fire pits, still warm to the touch despite the team having recorded no recent ignition. Seasonal flooding had left silt deposits along the lower stilts and eroded portions of the walkways, yet the village preserved a symmetry inconsistent with the rapid decay typical of abandoned Amazonian structures, defying both natural expectation and historical precedent. Palms had begun to root among floorboards and the edges of raised platforms, yet the core living spaces appeared unnaturally intact. Sediment layers along the riverbank, verified in other research, indicate that flooding can shift several centimetres of earth in a single season, enough to tilt or undermine stilts. Yet here the alignment of homes remained unnervingly precise. Mangrove seedlings and underbrush had grown along the periphery, but main thoroughfares and central plazas remained free of encroachment, leaving the impression that a careful hand had preserved these spaces. Comparing their observations to historical maps and accounts from earlier Puris River expeditions, the researchers noted discrepancies. Houses appeared in positions unmarked in surveys, and remnants of gardens aligned with water flow in ways that no previous team had recorded. 19th and 20th century records describe settlements along the Puris as relatively small and dispersed, often abandoned during the rubber boom, and again during periods of disease or relocation. Oral histories gathered from neighbouring communities mention abandoned villages, some reclaimed by the forest, but none described the level of order the expedition now faced. Even GPS coordinates gathered by previous teams did not correspond precisely to the current village layout, and some of the longhouses appeared on land thought to have been submerged or scrubland. Every reference reinforced the inconsistency, heightening the sense that the village existed in a space partially outside recorded time. Amid the silent longhouses, a series of carefully stacked tools and partially repaired walls hinted at a presence unseen, the deliberate order of objects contrasting sharply with the chaos expected in abandoned settlements. Wooden implements leaned against support posts with the tips pointing inland, and bundles of thatch were arranged beside partially rebuilt roofing frames. Canoes, weathered but righted and moored in exact parallel along the river's edge, suggested intervention by hands that understood the village's functional logic. No one in the expedition claimed knowledge of these repairs, nor had any of the recorded indigenous guides described them. Every layer of observation, the stilts, the footpaths, the cooking areas, the stacked tools, implied attention, care and repetition, yet the responsible agent remained absent. The forest's usual noises, the chatter of monkeys, the hum of insects, seemed muted here, as if nature itself had deferred to the unseen presence that maintained the settlement. As they retreated toward their canoes, the expedition could not shake the sense that the village had observed them, patiently waiting for a return that might never come. The lights over Seredu Divisa. As the 1987 Seredu Divisa scientific survey expedition climbed the sandstone ridges at dusk, the first flickering glimmers appeared above the forest canopy, casting irregular shadows across the river valleys below. The team had been charting geomagnetic variations and documenting biodiversity, expecting a quiet night of observation, but the sudden appearance of lights brought an immediate tension that settled across the camp. The peaks of the Serra de Divisor rise abruptly from the dense rainforest, creating isolated plateaus whose slopes funnel wind and channel sounds in unexpected ways. From this vantage, the canopy stretched like a living carpet, yet the lights above it seemed almost suspended, moving with a purpose that contradicted the natural rhythms of the forest. Initial photographs captured faint streaks and glimmers, prompting the team to recalibrate their instruments while debating whether the phenomena were optical illusions or an unknown atmospheric event. The lights pulsed in shifting hues of green, orange, and pale blue, their movement defying the steady wind currents and the typical patterns of atmospheric airglow that the team had expected to record. Observations of equatorial airglow indicate faint green or red bands caused by oxygen and sodium recombination at high altitudes, but these lights were sharper, more concentrated, and appeared far lower in the sky than standard emissions. Even the occasional flashes of lightning from distant storms did not account for the pattern or regularity, and no cloud cover could explain the sudden clarity. The team measured colour temperatures with handheld spectrometers, noting discrepancies between expected chemical signatures and what was recorded. The lights shimmered, sometimes splitting into twin arcs or trailing behind invisible currents, suggesting a physical presence or alignment that no member could readily identify. From the treetops to the riverbanks, wildlife reacted with unusual intensity. Night birds froze mid-flight, swarms of insects swirled and dispersed, and the mirrored surface of the Purus reflected luminous arcs that seemed suspended in space. Owls remained perched silently, their large eyes reflecting the light in twin orbs, while smaller birds emitted alarm calls rarely heard in their nocturnal routines. Insects that typically rely on moonlight for navigation exhibited erratic flight, creating erratic columns of movement visible against the dark foliage. River currents, normally rippling with subtle reflections from the moon, now mirrored arcs of colour that shifted unpredictably. The phenomenon elicited a combination of fascination and unease. Even the forest, usually alive with nocturnal sound, seemed to pause in response to the illumination. Compasses wavered erratically, magnetometers registered brief surges, and long exposure photographs captured spectral bands of light that did not correspond to any known terrestrial or celestial sources in the region. Field scientists had trained extensively to recognize geomagnetic disturbances caused by solar flares or local mineral deposits, yet the Seredu Divisa's relatively stable readings contradicted the erratic fluctuations being recorded. Photographic plates displayed arcs and streaks inconsistent with the star's fixed positions or movement across the equatorial night sky. Attempts to triangulate the light's position using multiple vantage points resulted in conflicting coordinates, creating the unsettling possibility that either the lights were moving in 3 dimensions in impossible ways, or that perception itself was being subtly influenced by an unknown environmental factor. Over the course of several hours, the lights traced arcs and pulses that suggested deliberate motion, their rhythm reminiscent of reports from historical equatorial aurora, anomalies and local accounts of wandering fires above Serra do Divisa. Early 20th century explorers occasionally reported luminous phenomena along these same ridges, attributing them to marsh gas, distant lightning, or rare geomagnetic anomalies, but none provided sufficient documentation to satisfy scientific scrutiny. Indigenous oral traditions spoke of fires in the sky that marked hunting or ceremonial times, describing a consistency in placement and duration that echoed the team's contemporary observations. The repeated arcs, splitting and converging, implied an organised behaviour within the phenomenon itself, a pattern that human or known atmospheric processes could not fully replicate. Despite using identical instruments and standing mere meters apart, members of the expedition recorded different angles and intensities of the lights, revealing the subjectivity of perception amid the forest's whispering darkness. One scientist noted a subtle orange hue behind the western plateau, while another insisted on a deep green shimmer above the riverbank. Audio recordings captured faint, unidentifiable crackles that did not match insect or amphibian activity, and the wind carried an occasional metallic tang unfamiliar to the team. This divergence of observation reinforced the expedition's sense of isolation. The forest, though physically surrounding them, seemed to amplify the anomaly's strangeness, making shared reality slippery and uncertain. Even as the first hints of dawn began to bleach the canopy, traces of the lights lingered in faint ground reflections, subtle shadows, and residual magnetic disturbances that no explanation could fully account for. The team documented these after effects meticulously: slightly scorched leaf tips, brief shifts in compass readings, and a lingering visual imprint of arcs on photographic plates. The natural light of the rising sun illuminated the sandstone ridges, yet the memory of spectral colours refused to fade, leaving an impression that the phenomenon existed both as a tangible event and as an echo in perception. Data collected would take months to analyse, yet no post-processing would fully reconcile the discrepancy between what was seen, recorded, and physically measurable. And though the expedition retreated into the safety of the lower valleys, the memory of those luminous arcs hovered over Serra do Divisor, as if the night itself had left a secret waiting to be deciphered. The echoes of the Javari Corridor. A low, rolling resonance coursed through the dense undergrowth of the Javari Corridor, bouncing unpredictably off river bends and towering kapok trees, as though the forest itself had learned to mimic voices it had never heard. The expedition, part of the 2004 Brazilian-Peruvian border survey, had navigated this remote stretch of the Amazon with the expectation of mapping tributaries and cataloguing biodiversity, yet the forest greeted them with something entirely unanticipated. From the narrow channels of the Javari River to the thick mat of lianas and leaf litter, sound travelled in ways the team had never measured, bending and refracting through pockets of dense vegetation. Early attempts to locate the source proved futile. Each echo seemed to originate from multiple points at once, a diffuse chorus that confounded both ears and instruments. The canopy above quivered with nocturnal life, yet these echoes carried an order and resonance that no known assemblage of wildlife could replicate, suggesting a pattern that hovered between the natural and the inexplicable. The tone shifted between sharp, clipped bursts reminiscent of distant birds and long undulating hums that carried over the flooded forest floor, resisting classification by any known species in the region. Howler monkeys with their deep resonances and river dolphins with ultrasonic clicks produced sounds entirely different from the anomalies recorded, and the patterns persisted regardless of time or location along the corridor. The team documented each instance with portable recorders and field spectrograms, noting irregular intervals and abrupt shifts in frequency. Even the rhythmic cadence, which resembled syllables or structured calls, did not match any recognized behavior in Amazonian fauna, leaving a tension that threaded through the humid night air. Every new burst seemed to respond to the last, creating a tentative dialogue that was as mesmerizing as it was unsettling, as if the forest itself were testing the boundaries of human perception. Branches, leaves, and water reflected and refracted the sounds in complex patterns, producing layered echoes that amplified in some areas and vanished completely in others, revealing the jungle's natural acoustic labyrinth. Flooded channels acted as resonant surfaces, carrying low tones farther than the naked eye could track, while fallen logs and submerged roots scattered higher frequencies into chaotic arrays. Scientists familiar with equatorial rainforest acoustics recognized that temperature and humidity gradients could bend sound, yet these variables alone could not account for the precision of echoes that returned in measurable, repeatable intervals. Even minor shifts in position, stepping behind a kapok or into a shallow bend, altered the reception in ways that suggested the forest was not merely passive, but actively shaping the way sound travelled through its complex geometry. Hydrophones submerged along tributary edges and parabolic microphones aimed at the canopy recorded anomalies in frequency and repetition, producing spectrograms that defied patterns expected from animal vocalizations or river turbulence. Each recording revealed harmonics and overtone structures that suggested intentionality, yet the team could not locate a physical source. Measurements of decibel levels fluctuated without apparent cause, and directional bearings often contradicted each other. Attempts to map the echoes spatially resulted in data points that intersected and overlapped unnaturally, hinting at a three-dimensional complexity that neither theory nor instrumentation could fully resolve. Notes taken in the field compared the recordings to known acoustic phenomena in equatorial forests, from thermal inversions to cicada choruses, but nothing matched the sustained clarity and irregular cadence of these auditory anomalies. As the nights progressed, certain echoes appeared to follow movement, repeating in intervals that suggested deliberate response, a phenomenon vaguely reminiscent of long-distance acoustic signalling reported in isolated Amazonian communities. Indigenous reports occasionally mention voices of the forest that guide or warn travellers, yet these expeditions moved through areas devoid of any settlements, and the echoes retained a precision that defied natural mimicry. The team experimented by producing deliberate sounds, calls, claps and instrument taps, each followed by returns that adjusted to the origin point. Even when they remained silent, the echoes occasionally returned in subtle, near imperceptible patterns, giving the impression that the forest had a rhythm of its own, one not entirely bound to chance or biology. The team's observations diverged sharply. Some heard sequences resembling syllables or rhythm, while others interpreted the same echoes as random forest noise, deepening their uncertainty and heightening the forest's enigmatic presence. Differences in perception highlighted not only the subjective nature of auditory experience, but also the challenge of reconciling human expectation with the extraordinary complexity of the rainforest. Occasional Doppler-like shifts, likely caused by moving air or river currents, compounded the difficulty of interpreting the signals. Each member carried recording equipment, yet playback often failed to convey the same nuances perceived in real time, leaving lingering doubt about whether the forest's voice was objective or mediated by human senses. With the first hints of dawn, the echoes faded into the normal sounds of river and jungle, yet recordings preserved subtle irregularities and rhythmic patterns too precise to dismiss, implying an unseen agency shaping the forest's acoustic space. The morning brought sunlight filtering through a mist of suspended water droplets, and birds resumed their familiar calls, but the memory of structured, responsive echoes left a residual unease. Instruments showed minor magnetic fluctuations and slight pressure anomalies, perhaps artifacts of the night's acoustic disturbances, reinforcing the notion that the phenomena had a tangible, if invisible, presence. The team reviewed every recording, mapping frequencies and intervals, yet no natural explanation accounted for the persistence, precision, or apparent responsiveness of the echoes, leaving a puzzle as deep and layered as the corridor itself. Even after the expedition withdrew, the memory of those responsive echoes lingered, as if the Javari corridor had learned to listen and had not yet finished speaking. The Lost Guide of the Tapajos. The Tapajos River stretched in wide, languid arcs beneath a rising sun, its tannin-stained waters threading through emerald forests that had resisted thorough mapping for centuries, and the expedition's guide moved confidently along its banks, reading subtle cues invisible to the untrained eye. The 2011 Brazilian Amazon survey had relied on his decades of experience to navigate seasonal shifts, fallen trees, and hidden channels that might trap an inexperienced crew. Each bend of the river, each slight rise in the muddy banks provided him with information that the team could only observe but never fully interpret. The humid air carried the faint, musky scent of decomposing vegetation mixed with the sharp aroma of river sediments, yet the guide seemed attuned to every ripple, every insect call, every bird alarm. He checked the water's flow, adjusted the canoe against an unseen current, and signalled the team to follow a path that appeared almost imperceptible to the others. A sudden call from the guide ended abruptly, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the murmur of water. Within moments he'd vanished from sight, as though swallowed by the river's curves or the dense labyrinth of fallen trees and undergrowth. Panic spread through the team like a silent contagion. Instruments that had mapped the river with precise GPS points suddenly seemed insufficient against the dense foliage and shifting currents. Every shouted name, every whistle was absorbed and scattered by the forest, leaving only echoes that misled and confused. The team's collective expertise could not compensate for the sudden absence of the guide, whose intimate knowledge of the river's hazards had kept them safe until this inexplicable disappearance. The team spread along the muddy bank, examining faint footprints in the saturated soil, noting the direction of displaced twigs and crushed leaf litter, while referencing seasonal river charts that should have ensured the guide's chosen path remained navigable. Small details became critical: the depth of each footprint, the angle of displacement in leaves, and the slight indentation left by a boot heel provided frustratingly incomplete clues. Seasonal flood maps indicated the river's high water channels, yet none matched the subtle nuances of the guide's intended route. The team's biologists and navigators recorded every observation, aware that even minor deviations in the landscape could hold significance in the labyrinthine forest. Birds that normally called through the canopy fell silent, monkeys paused mid-motion, and the occasional ripple of riverfish betrayed agitation, subtle signs that the forest and river were responding in real time to the disturbance, complicating the search. Insects, too, altered their patterns. Dragonflies and midges swirled differently, and the soft rustle of leafcutter ants changed, as if the ecosystem itself registered an irregular presence. The team noted these environmental cues, aware that many species in the Tapajos respond instinctively to movement and human intrusion, and tried to separate natural reactions from signs of the guide's passage. Yet every observation seemed ambiguous, teetering between explanation and uncertainty, leaving a gnawing tension in the air. The team examined subtle ripples in the river's surface, noting how submerged logs and fallen palm fronds created miniature eddies that would normally guide a canoeist along safe passages. Yet these natural indicators seemed misleading in the section where the guide disappeared. They compared the current flow and sediment deposits against historical hydrological charts of the Tapajos, which indicated that seasonal flooding should have created shallow channels visible from the riverbank. Water temperature readings and microcurrents suggested that parts of the river had shifted overnight, carrying floating vegetation and small debris in unusual patterns. Fish activity observed in the shallows revealed feeding behaviours that normally aligned with slow-moving water but were disrupted here, implying a recent disturbance in currents or underwater obstacles. These observations reinforced the unsettling notion that even natural cues the guide relied upon were in flux, leaving the team vulnerable and dependent on incomplete environmental intelligence. Broken branches, depressions in moss, and traces of recently cut vines suggested movement in one direction, yet footprints dissolved into indistinguishable mud, leaving the team to question whether they were pursuing the guide or chasing a phantom echo of human presence. Every trace that promised clarity dissolved under scrutiny. The wet mud pulled at boots, erasing evidence faster than it could be catalogued. Machete cuts appeared in patterns inconsistent with the guide's known habits, and disturbed leaf litter suggested deliberate arrangement, though no human presence could be confirmed. The forest density made it impossible to view more than a few meters ahead, and every attempted path seemed to vanish into a new maze of waterlogged roots and undergrowth. As the sun arced toward afternoon, shifting shadows, rising water levels, and the thickening humidity altered the landscape in ways that erased tracks and muddled bearings, compressing time and amplifying the team's disorientation. The river, which had seemed predictable in the morning, now curved unexpectedly, submerging familiar banks and exposing new ones. Pools formed and drained in mere hours, creating illusions of continuity where none existed. The forest seemed to breathe around them, air dense with humidity, leaves dripping and vines swaying, all conspiring to distort spatial awareness. The team's reliance on the guide's prior knowledge became painfully apparent as every instinct they relied upon faltered against the forest's fluidity. Amid a tangle of flooded undergrowth, they discovered a single perfectly aligned machete cut on a sapling, clean and precise, unlike any made by the guide, suggesting deliberate intent, yet leaving no clue as to by whom or why it had been left. It stood alone, unaccompanied by tracks or other signs of passage, a quiet but unnerving testament to presence and absence simultaneously. Every attempt to trace it back in time or direction yielded nothing. The surrounding soil and vegetation betrayed no evidence of human activity. Instruments recorded the cut as recent, yet no one claimed responsibility, and the precision suggested knowledge and care beyond mere coincidence. It was the kind of detail that left the mind grasping for explanation but finding none. A subtle disruption in an otherwise meticulously recorded environment. When the expedition finally withdrew from the Tapajos, the forest retained its secret, as if the guide had vanished not into the jungle but into the river itself, leaving only questions behind. The map that drew itself. Dawn filtered through the dense canopy as the Upper Tapajos cartographic expedition set up its instruments, recording every bend of the river and curve of the floodplain with meticulous care, unaware that the maps themselves would soon begin to change independently. The team, composed of 3 geospatial specialists, 2 hydrologists and a field ecologist, worked with precision honed from months in the Amazon, calibrating handheld GPS devices, portable LiDAR scanners and sketch pads against the humid, shifting environment. The air was thick with humidity, hovering near 90%, while the scent of decaying leaves, river sediment and damp wood mingled with the faint fragrance of flowering lianas along the riverbank. Even setting up tripods and UAVs required care, as thin, moss-covered logs threatened to slip underfoot, reminding the team that the forest was both guide and obstacle. Every measurement was cross-checked against previous satellite imagery and hydrological charts, which indicated how the Tapajos and its tributaries swelled and receded with predictable seasonal flooding. Yet here, the forest logic would soon betray expectation. By mid-morning, drone-mounted LiDAR sweeps revealed subtle discrepancies between the digital terrain models and the team's earlier sketches, suggesting that features once considered permanent were shifting imperceptibly beneath their instruments. Tree clusters previously marked on initial surveys appeared slightly displaced, narrow tributaries widened or narrowed, and marshy patches once solid enough to traverse were now partially submerged. The LiDAR pulses, capable of penetrating canopy gaps to detect ground elevations within 10 centimeters, reflected off leaves, water and sediment in complex patterns, making the subtle anomalies impossible to dismiss as measurement error. Drone navigation required careful compensation for GPS interference caused by dense foliage, and even after multiple passes, inconsistencies persisted, forcing the team to question whether they truly understood the terrain. Historical satellite images, meticulously layered against current data, exposed forest clearings and meandering channels that appeared and vanished with no discernible natural cause, challenging both expectation and expertise. Landsat and Sentinel imagery spanning decades were cross-referenced to track sediment deposition, river meanders, and seasonal floodplain inundation. While flood-driven islands can form and erode over months or years, the observed shifts occurred within hours, appearing and disappearing in ways that defied established hydrological models. These anomalies were not subtle. A half-hectare clearing that existed in one pass would vanish in the next, while a narrow channel aligned perfectly in the digital record remained invisible on the ground. The team meticulously logged each discrepancy, noting the impossibility of reconciling instruments with the forest's apparent autonomy. Returning to the same coordinates later in the afternoon, the team found GPS tracks that contradicted their own measurements, as if the very landscape had rewritten itself while they were momentarily distracted. They retraced carefully measured transects, recalibrating devices at each marker, but the data points now diverged from prior readings. Tributaries that had been navigable appeared suddenly blocked by unrecorded debris or shallow sediment, while previously dry patches were digitally indicated as flooded. Triangulations using traditional compasses and measuring tapes could not resolve the conflict, and repeated discussions highlighted an unsettling loop. Each human attempt to correct the map was already outpaced by new, inexplicable changes in the landscape. Sudden gusts of wind stirred fallen leaves across the floodplain, and a brief tropical shower blurred riverbank edges, coinciding with unexplained shifts in the digital layers that suggested the forest's presence was subtly influencing the instruments. Canopy density affected GPS signals, rainfall altered river turbidity, and cloud shadows interfered with LiDAR reflections, all creating minor, predictable distortions. Yet the anomalies persisted far beyond these environmental effects. Mapped islands, bends, and clearings appeared in perfect alignment across multiple datasets, behaving with a precision that no known natural or instrumental cause could explain. Even as the team adjusted for drift, recalibrated instruments, and attempted to model river flow and sediment transport, the forest seemed to actively resist their measurements, almost as if observing and responding to their actions. Multiple data streams, LiDAR, satellite, and GPS, now converged on impossible alignments. A small island and a sharply curved tributary registered in all readings, yet no sign existed on the ground, confounding every expectation of permanence. The team meticulously documented each discrepancy, taking additional measurements at varying times of day and in different light conditions. GPS drift was accounted for, sensor noise reduced, and manual sketches compared against drone overflights. Each attempt only confirmed the anomaly. The feature existed in multiple independent layers, mapped with exact precision, but was physically absent. This convergence, grounded in repeatable, verifiable measurements, reinforced the sense that the forest was both present and unknowable, a landscape governed by rules that instruments could record but humans could not interpret. Twilight revealed one last anomaly to the team, a river bend and sandbar mapped with exacting precision, yet the physical terrain gave nothing away, as though the forest had etched it into the instruments themselves. Every detail, the curvature of the channel, the gentle rise of the sandbar, the placement of emergent vegetation, was captured perfectly in LiDAR scans, drone imagery, and satellite passes. Field attempts to locate it yielded only unbroken water and dense forest floor, while repeated measurements confirmed its coordinates. The anomaly's persistence across time, instruments, and observation cycles created a paradox. The mapped feature existed, yet could not be walked, touched, or measured on the ground. Subtle reflections in water surfaces and leaf arrangements suggested continuity, but not reality, deepening the expedition's sense that the map was no longer merely a tool, it had become an autonomous record of something beyond human comprehension. Beyond the reach of the explorers, the maps of the Tapajos lingered, inscribed with a geography that could not be followed, revealing a forest that moved quietly around those who entered. The unseen builders of Acre. At first light, the Acre archaeological expedition emerged from the forest canopy to find a cluster of low earthen mounds, whose scale and symmetry immediately contradicted every map and record of pre-Columbian settlement in the region. Mist curled among the dense floodplain vegetation, catching early sunlight and casting a shifting lattice of shadows across the ground. The hum of cicadas mixed with distant howler monkey calls, while the scent of wet clay, decomposing leaves, and flowering lianas pervaded the air. Team members carefully unpacked instruments, marking reference points with bamboo stakes and setting up tripods for total stations and GPS receivers. Every careful step over moss-covered roots and spongy soil emphasized the isolation of the site, while the team's anticipation grew, each mound presenting a visual puzzle that defied prior expectations. Closer inspection revealed compacted soil layers, faint post holes, and subtle depressions between mounds, suggesting careful construction rather than natural accumulation or erosion. Soil probes showed alternating layers of dark organic matter and pale clay, evidence of deliberate layering to enhance stability and fertility. Tiny post holes, only 10 centimeters in diameter, hinted at decayed wooden frameworks, and faint indentations suggested paths or communal spaces that once guided human movement. The team noted traces of erosion that seemed intentionally mitigated by mound design, while microfossils of plant remains pointed to long-term occupation. Observing the site, they realized that the amount of labor required to compact and shape these mounds far exceeded any casual human activity, making it clear that a coordinated effort had been undertaken, though by whom remained unknown. As the team moved outward, raised terraces stretched across the floodplain, engineered to resist seasonal inundation with gradients and retaining edges that hinted at precise, deliberate labor. Water pooled in minor depressions between terraces, and the team carefully recorded the subtle slope of each embankment, noting variations of less than 5 degrees. sediment analysis confirmed a blend of local clay and imported organic matter, consistent with pre-Columbian Amazonian practices designed to maintain soil fertility. Trees and shrubs had taken root along the terraces, their root systems stabilizing soil while also reflecting centuries of interaction between flora and human-altered earth. Small channels cut between terraces directed water flow, and observations suggested that this network had been maintained to accommodate seasonal floods, an engineering solution both practical and sophisticated. Measurements of mound spacing and alignment disclosed patterns too regular to match known settlement practices, with angles and distances repeating across multiple clusters in ways that defied ethnographic expectation. The team used total stations to record precise coordinates, discovering that mound clusters repeated distances of roughly 35 to 40 meters, aligned along axes that intersected predictably. Such geometric regularity was absent from documented historical settlements, which relied on environmental adaptation rather than systematic alignment. Field notes documented astonishment as researchers compared the data against ethnographic norms, noting that no known local culture had produced such mathematically consistent layouts across the floodplain. Excavated soil revealed a mix of terra preta and alluvial deposits, while remnants of cultivated plants indicated human influence persisted centuries beyond the assumed occupation periods. Charred maize cobs and manioc roots were preserved in the dark, fertile soil, alongside cacao husks whose pollen indicated deliberate planting. Pollen and seed analysis revealed patterns of agricultural sophistication. Companion planting and crop rotation implied intentional long-term soil management. Isotopic analysis of the soil suggested organic enrichment methods were carefully maintained over decades, highlighting a continuity of care and knowledge that could not be explained by brief habitation. Each discovery reinforced the idea that these builders possessed an advanced understanding of both agriculture and landscape engineering. Past the terraces, linear embankments and raised plazas came into view, their careful proportions a testament to engineering skill and labour that challenged the team's expectations of Amazonian societies. Measuring over 100 metres in length, some embankments appeared designed for communal or ceremonial purposes, delineated by precise edges and smooth levelled surfaces. Despite centuries of tropical rainfall, erosion and flood events, the embankments retained their structural integrity. The team noted subtle microtopography changes, documenting depressions and elevations that suggested intentional shaping to manage water runoff and pedestrian movement. Sounds of water trickling through minor channels and the whisper of wind through the canopy accentuated the eerie stillness surrounding these engineered forms. The final and most confounding discovery was a vast mound precisely oriented along cardinal points and coinciding with natural hydrological channels, an arrangement that implied foresight and planning beyond any known historical framework. Using both compass readings and solar positioning, the team confirmed the mound's axis aligned perfectly north-south, while subsidiary terraces integrated seamlessly with seasonal water channels, balancing stability and utility. Despite repeated measurement, every instrument confirmed the orientation, and no historical record accounted for this precision. Light falling across the mound highlighted its geometric symmetry, and minor shadows revealed subtle levelling techniques suggesting deliberate human modification. The careful coordination of orientation, hydrology and construction left the team grappling with the reality of intentional design without a known architect. Between the terraces and embankments, subtle marks of tools and maintenance told a story of a repeated human presence across the ages. Small grooves in the clay suggested scraping or levelling with wooden implements, while faint impressions of sandals and boot soles appeared in soft soil near the mound bases. Leaf litter had been pushed aside in linear patterns, and scattered fragments of charcoal indicated periodic fires, likely for land clearing or soil enrichment. Insects had colonised some areas, yet the overall symmetry of the site remained undisturbed, implying careful management. Even small stones and plant debris appeared deliberately arranged along terrace edges, as though each element had been placed with intention, reinforcing the idea that the landscape had been continuously shaped by unseen hands long after conventional occupation periods ended. Shadows stretched across the forest as the sun sank, leaving the acre earthworks silent yet exact, as though unseen hands still moved among them. The drums beyond the canopy. Faint, irregular beats threaded through the morning humidity, barely audible above the rustle of leaves and the chorus of distant toucans as the Tapachos expedition paused to identify their origin. At first, the sound seemed like another layer of the rainforest natural cacophony, blending with wind in the canopy and the low hum of insect activity, yet its precision suggested something more deliberate. Team members exchanged uneasy glances, each aware that in a region mapped for decades, every familiar sound had been catalogued, yet these beats defied expectation. Every footfall on damp leaf litter seemed to accentuate the rhythm, as though the forest itself had become a drumskin under their careful passage. Humidity hung heavy over the floodplain, and every drifting mist tendril seemed to carry sound differently, while the thick canopy above distorted light and muffled footsteps. Sunlight filtered sporadically, highlighting clumps of moss and lianas that had grown unchecked over fallen trunks. The river's distant gurgle provided a natural baseline of noise, yet the rhythmic tapping persisted, precise enough to demand careful attention. Observers noted how air density and moisture influenced the propagation of the sound, a factor that complicated efforts to localize its source, while nearby vegetation swayed subtly, disturbed by nothing apparent. Microphones mounted on tall tripods quivered slightly in the soft breeze, capturing decibels and pulse intervals as the team meticulously logged GPS coordinates for each auditory anomaly. Directional recorders rotated, picking up beats from multiple angles, while sound spectrum analyzers visualized frequency peaks in real time. Every team member was assigned a station. One monitored amplitude, another checked rhythmic intervals, and a third cross-referenced environmental noises for possible interference. The expedition's standard protocols for acoustic research, developed over years in the Amazon, allowed them to distinguish between animal, hydrological, and atmospheric contributions, yet nothing in their data matched any known natural pattern. As the expedition pushed deeper along a narrow, winding path, the beats shifted in location and intensity, echoing unpredictably between branches and fallen logs, leaving the team both intrigued and disoriented. The rhythm sometimes seemed closer than it had moments before, then vanished entirely, only to return from a different direction. Team members paused frequently, adjusting headphones and microphones to capture subtle variations. Leaf litter, branches, and soft soil carried vibrations in unpredictable ways, producing overlapping echoes that confounded linear tracking. With each step, the forest appeared simultaneously familiar and alien, a labyrinth in which sound alone guided the explorers. Spectral graphs on laptops flickered with peaks and troughs, displaying rhythmic pulses at frequencies that matched no recorded animal calls, while the team cross-referenced historical sound libraries for comparison. Oscillographs revealed pulses repeating at intervals precise to a fraction of a second, inconsistent with cicadas, birds, or amphibians. Even known low-frequency sounds of large mammals such as tapirs or jaguars failed to replicate the regularity detected. Specialists in acoustic ecology discussed hypotheses considering echoes, natural resonance, or infrasound, but none could account for the combination of precision, duration, and variability captured by the expedition's instruments. Leafcutter ants marched in familiar trails, cicadas droned overhead, and howler monkeys bellowed, yet none produced patterns that aligned with the regular, almost mechanical drumming penetrating the dense foliage. The team scanned the canopy for nests, roosts, or emergent behaviors that might explain the sound. Fungi, decomposing trees, and wind through lianas were considered, but careful measurement and comparison to prior recordings revealed none could produce the rhythmic pulses observed. The distinction became clearer. While the forest produced many overlapping sounds, the drumming appeared intentional, as though guided by some unseen arboreal architect. The pulses repeated with impossible precision, layering over one another in a way that suggested orchestration, as if multiple unseen drummers were performing in perfect synchrony across the canopy. Timing intervals held steady despite shifts in wind, light, or temperature, while beats propagated from locations that instruments indicated were uninhabited by fauna. Attempts to triangulate a single source yielded inconsistent results. The rhythm seemed to occupy the forest like a living instrument, simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. Observers felt the weight of silence between pulses as sharply as the rhythm itself, a deliberate cadence that heightened the sense of alien order in the natural environment. Fallen logs were struck, river channels tapped, and makeshift drums improvised, yet the resulting sounds never mirrored the persistent rhythms that seemed to respond to no visible source. Even using simple percussion to test acoustic reflections in the canopy, the team could not reproduce the precise interval patterns recorded over several hours. Microphones placed at differing elevations confirmed the beats arrived from multiple planes, suggesting a three-dimensional orchestration rather than a single emanating point. Discussions circled theories of echo effects and harmonic resonance, yet every hypothesis fell short of explaining the regularity and layering, emphasizing the unexplainable nature of the phenomenon. The beats intensified in clarity and alignment precisely where no trees, animals, or human paths existed, verified simultaneously by multiple instruments, confirming the auditory phenomenon's unexplainable persistence. The team documented GPS coordinates, plotted sound intensity, and reviewed playback in real time. All evidence indicated a measurable, organized source with physical presence in space, yet repeated visual surveys revealed nothing. Shadows of branches moved normally, leaves rustled under light wind, yet the sound's persistence suggested an active but invisible agent, one that manipulated the acoustic properties of the forest without leaving physical traces. Surrounded by the canopy's shadows and the river's murmur, the Tapajos expedition could only record, analyze, and speculate, noting patterns too precise to be random and too elaborate for wildlife alone to produce. The team remained rooted in methodology, documenting pulse intervals, verifying environmental conditions, and cross-referencing biological and meteorological data. Each experiment and observation only deepened the mystery, leaving unanswered the question of what could generate such a persistent rhythm. Even seasoned ecologists familiar with the unexpected behaviors of Amazonian wildlife acknowledged that the sounds did not correspond to any known natural or human source. Over the canopy, or perhaps just out of reach, the rhythm played on, as if guided by a hand no human had ever seen or heard. The disappearing footprints of Madre de Dios. Soft impressions in the damp clay of Madre de Dios drew the expedition's attention, each carefully shaped footprint marking a path that should have been predictable but carried an unusual clarity. At first glance, they resembled ordinary human tracks, yet their crisp edges and uniform depth immediately suggested they had been formed very recently. The Tapajos expedition paused, noting the odd alignment of prints that led away from the narrow survey path, extending into the dense undergrowth. Every step taken by the explorers seemed to echo in the mud beneath them, a tactile reminder of how fleeting yet precise human traces can be in the rainforest's mutable floor. Measuring the depth, width and stride, the team calculated the weight distribution and gait of whoever or whatever had left the marks, noting subtle details like heel curvature and toe spread. Experienced trackers commented on the symmetry and proportion, which aligned with an adult human but also displayed unusual uniformity. Comparisons with known team members' prints immediately revealed discrepancies. No one in the expedition had left tracks that matched exactly in size and pressure. Notes were made regarding stride length, suggesting normal walking speed in some areas and an almost imperceptible pause in others, as though the foot had been momentarily suspended mid-step. The rainforest floor was a complex tapestry of silt, decomposing leaf litter, and fine sand with pockets of clay that typically preserve footprints for days, yet here something seemed to defy that expectation. Leaf litter often collapsed into impressions, and rain normally blurred tracks within hours, but these prints remained undisturbed and clearly defined. Roots, fallen branches, and the occasional burrowed insect hole would normally distort such impressions, yet the footprints threaded perfectly around obstacles, avoiding even the most prominent roots and depressions in the terrain. Some tracks disappeared abruptly between two tree trunks where soil conditions should have maintained them, leaving the explorers puzzled and instinctively retracing their steps. 1 minute, an unmistakable impression marked a clear path. The next, nothing remained, as though the footprint had evaporated. Photographs were compared in real time, confirming that the disappearance had occurred within minutes. Discussions arose about natural explanations, wind, moisture, and small animal interference, yet none could account for the precision with which the footprints vanished while surrounding vegetation remained untouched. Cameras clicked, plaster molds hardened, and GPS points were logged, the team painstakingly recording each impression while consulting prior field guides for known environmental effects on footprint longevity. every print was meticulously documented. Depth, orientation, soil composition, and leaf litter coverage were noted in detailed logs. The Tapajos expedition relied on field methods developed for rapid rainforest documentation, including time-stamped photography and GPS triangulation, to ensure that the vanishing impressions could be verified independently. The precision of documentation only heightened the strangeness, as every track recorded disappeared shortly after being logged. Rainfall, river overflows, insect disturbance, and root growth were examined as potential erasers of the marks, yet all natural processes fell short of explaining the footprint's selective vanishing. Seasonal moisture and rainfall patterns were carefully measured, noting that no precipitation had occurred in the hours since the tracks appeared. Ant activity and leafcutter paths were observed nearby, but never intersected the footprints in a manner consistent with their disappearance. Even minor soil subsidence due to tree roots or micromounds of clay could not account for the abrupt removal of tracks across flat, undisturbed terrain. Following the trail deeper into dense understory, the team observed footprints reappearing in altered orientations, some leading around obstacles in ways that would have required extraordinary agility. Tracks appeared to twist and turn unnaturally, veering around boulders and fallen trunks with exacting precision. At times, prints seemed to follow a trajectory that no human could achieve without bending or twisting their body into impossible angles, as though the foot had been guided externally. Observers noted the psychological effect. Each discovery intensified a creeping awareness that the forest itself, or something within it, was actively shaping the path. A closer inspection of the soil layers beneath each footprint revealed microscopic disturbances inconsistent with normal human or animal movement. Using a small trowel and magnifying lens, the team observed subtle compression of subsoil strata and minute displacement of fungal hyphae, indicating that the pressure of the prints had interacted with the ground in ways that should have left permanent traces, yet subsequent checks showed those distortions had vanished or reformed elsewhere. Leaf litter above the impressions remained largely intact, and minute insects that normally colonized disturbed soil were absent from the tracks. Laboratory-grade moisture meters confirmed the clay content was unusually high in some areas, which should have retained the impressions for days, yet the prints changed or disappeared within hours. The team documented these anomalies with photographs and sketches, noting that the combination of soil chemistry, moisture, and biological inactivity defied known ecological behavior. Stride lengths and pressure points were compared across multiple prints, revealing inconsistencies that challenged their understanding of human or animal locomotion in the humid forest. Depth variations suggested weight shifting that did not match any known team member. Certain tracks indicated a right foot heavier than the left, but neighbouring impressions showed the opposite. Measurement tools and forensic logs confirmed these irregularities were real, not errors, leaving the team unable to rationalise the physical mechanics behind the formation or disappearance of the footprints. The most perplexing evidence lay where footprints traversed open clearings and shifted several feet from their previous positions, defying gravity and leaving the team unable to reconcile observation with logic. Plaster casts of one particularly puzzling footprint revealed exact detail in the toe curvature, arch, and heel, yet the cast was later found several meters away from where the original print had been recorded. GPS markers verified the anomaly, and repeated attempts to replicate the sequence by walking, jumping, or hopping along the same line failed. It was clear that the phenomenon operated under a set of rules unknown to the team, precise and deliberate, yet impossible to witness in real time. In the quiet of Madre de Dios, each vanished footprint whispered of an unseen presence shaping the forest floor with intent beyond human comprehension. The Black Mist at Alto Tarahuaca. A shadowy veil drifted along the trail, curling through the undergrowth with a density that seemed almost tangible to the Tapajos expedition. The team, moving cautiously along the narrow forest path, immediately sensed an unusual chill in the humid air. The forest canopy, normally alive with the filtered glow of late afternoon sun, now seemed muted, as though a shadow had been drawn across the entire slope. Insects that usually hummed in the warm air fell silent, and the occasional rustle of leaves sounded sharper, unnaturally crisp against the darkened backdrop. Initial impressions suggested ordinary fog, but the inky blackness carried weight, pressing against the senses in a way no Amazonian mist ever had, and even the team's most seasoned field guides felt an unspoken unease. The air thickened, carrying a damp, earthy scent, while visibility dropped in irregular pockets where sunlight struggled to penetrate. Small beams of light fractured into halos around leaves, creating odd reflections on the glossy surfaces of heliconia and bromeliad foliage. The forest floor, a tapestry of leaf litter, moss and fallen branches, seemed to shift underfoot. Each step produced the faintest compression in the detritus, but no moisture collected despite the damp sensation. The mist seemed almost deliberate in its density, forming swirling pockets that avoided some trees entirely while pooling along root systems and low ridges, behaviour inconsistent with standard condensation or fog. Hygrometers spiked unexpectedly, and thermometers recorded minute drops inconsistent with ambient shade or elevation, prompting meticulous cross-checks. Portable barometers revealed subtle fluctuations in pressure, and light meters detected dimming inconsistent with overcast conditions or canopy cover. Soil moisture probes registered anomalies in clay and loam layers that would normally retain water from overnight dew, yet the instruments showed only ephemeral increases that dissipated in minutes. The team compared readings with historical averages for Alto Tarawaca in the late wet season and found deviations beyond any recorded norm, intensifying both curiosity and caution. As the explorers advanced, the mist swelled in irregular waves, climbing slight inclines and curling around tree trunks as though guided by invisible currents. It moved uphill against gentle breezes, wrapping around buttressed roots and creeping along narrow ridges with a fluidity that defied gravitational expectation. Some saplings brushed by the veil trembled as though stirred by wind, while larger trees remained untouched, a selective interaction that suggested agency or purpose. Small rivulets and tributaries glimmered briefly as the black mist hovered above, yet the water remained undisturbed, reflecting no distortion from the swirling darkness above. Birds froze mid-flight, and leafcutter ants veered from familiar paths, while small mammals vanished into cover, their absence noted in sudden silence. Macaws perched motionless in the canopy, and capuchin monkeys watched from a distance, their usual curiosity replaced by tentative stillness. Amphibians in nearby pools ceased their calls, while freshwater fish near shallow streams became uncharacteristically sluggish, huddling under rocks or debris. Field biologists noted that many insects slowed movement or clustered differently, contrasting sharply with normal behaviour in humid Amazonian fog, creating an eerie stillness that accentuated the team's unease. Every leaf and moss patch touched by the mist exhibited subtle changes. Surfaces appeared damp yet retained no measurable water, an anomaly the team recorded carefully. Mosses that normally absorb moisture showed no saturation, while bromeliad tanks remained empty despite the lingering blackness. Leaves showed a faint, almost imperceptible sheen fading within moments. Samples collected for later analysis revealed no unusual compounds, no smoke residue, and no chemical signature beyond ambient forest matter. Lichen and ferns, typically sensitive to rapid humidity changes, remained unaffected, emphasizing how the mist's selective interaction with the environment defied known botanical responses. Field notes filled with competing theories: smoke, river fog, dew condensation, yet instruments and observation refused to support any conventional explanation. The teams considered distant forest fires, thermal inversions, and methane emissions from decomposing leaf litter, but none aligned with the mist's density, colour, or behaviour. Attempts to simulate the effect with portable atomizers or controlled smoke releases failed repeatedly, leaving only photographic evidence of the mist's inexplicable flow and selective coverage. Even the most experienced guides, accustomed to sudden microclimate shifts, admitted that the veil's behaviour suggested an intelligence, or at least a responsiveness, unlike any atmospheric phenomenon they had ever encountered. The mist moved selectively, drifting around some objects while enveloping others, leaving its motion seemingly deliberate, as though observing the team in return. Equipment on the forest floor, dry bags, tripods and camera traps, was partially shrouded while nearby rocks, fallen logs and tree bases remained clear. Observers stepping forward found their own forms intermittently blurred or sharply outlined, while light filtered through the canopy inconsistently, creating optical illusions that made depth and distance difficult to judge. Instruments occasionally registered irregular readings, transient spikes in particulate density, subtle electromagnetic variation and minute shifts in air pressure that coincided with the mist's movement, hinting at a complex, inexplicable interaction with the surrounding environment. When the black veil finally dissipated, the forest returned to normal with startling abruptness, leaving behind instruments recording odd fluctuations that defied interpretation. Thermometers, hygrometers and barometers all returned to baseline, while cameras captured only faint traces of ephemeral shadowing on foliage. The insects and birds resumed normal activity as if nothing had occurred. The explorers retraced their steps, finding no residue, no lasting impressions, and no physical disturbance on the forest floor beyond what would be expected in an untouched rainforest. Even the leaf litter and moss, once swirled by the mist, appeared pristine, erasing the very evidence of the encounter. In the hollow silence of Alto Tarahuaca, the memory of a dark, wandering mist lingered like a question the forest itself refused to answer. The Hollow Ridge of Jorua. The Tapajos Jorua expedition of 1987 approached the upper ridges of the Jorua River Basin with the kind of anticipation born from years of charting maps that suggested more questions than answers. Thick forest canopy gave way sporadically to moss-draped cliffs, and the air grew cooler as the team ascended what local guides called Serra do Buraco, or Hollow Ridge. The name itself seemed to hum with promise and warning, a whispered echo in a region already riddled with tales of vanishing camps and rivers that shifted overnight. Surveying the ridge from the slope below, the team noted the unusual symmetry of its spurs and the abrupt way the land dropped into deep, shadowed valleys, as if carved by a hand unwilling to leave its signature clear. Every step upward carried the weight of history and the expectation of discovery, tempered by a lingering unease that the forest here operated by rules unknown to outsiders. Climbers who reached the summit described the ridge as physically unremarkable at first glance, yet acoustically extraordinary. When shouted at from one rocky outcrop to another, their voices did not echo outward in the ordinary way. Instead, the sound seemed to vanish into a hollow resonance, returning faint, warped fragments that made the team question the dimensions of the ridge itself. Geologists accompanying the expedition attempted to map cavities using seismic and auditory instruments, finding patterns that suggested enormous internal voids, yet no surface openings or cave mouths appeared to exist. These instruments detected chambers potentially tens of meters across, stretching beneath the ridge like an architectural puzzle buried by millennia of erosion and vegetation. But no natural entrance revealed itself, leaving the hollow as inaccessible as it was enigmatic. The local communities along the Jorua had long told stories of Serra do Buraco, warning that certain parts of the ridge were alive with sound. Elderly fishermen spoke of hearing conversations and drumbeats emanate from nowhere, voices shaped as though by human intention, yet with a timbre impossible to place. Anthropologists studying these reports found recurring references to hollow mountains across western Amazonian oral history, but the tales offered little in terms of concrete geography, leaving the expedition to navigate between folklore and observable phenomena. The guides themselves hesitated to climb the ridge, insisting that even the wind seemed to behave strangely, sweeping across the slopes with patterns that no meteorological explanation could fully account for. As the team began to measure wind speeds and frequency, they noted anomalous acoustic feedback that magnified the low hums of the forest into a persistent, almost deliberate vibration. Among the most unsettling aspects of the Hollow Ridge were the animal behaviours observed near the summit. Bird species, common to the surrounding rainforest, avoided the uppermost ridges entirely, their calls conspicuously absent from an otherwise cacophonous dawn chorus. Mammals tracked with infrared cameras and scent stations appeared sporadically, often freezing in place when reaching the ridge's edge, their movements erratic as if responding to a stimulus invisible to human senses. Herpetologists on the expedition observed a marked absence of amphibians, species that thrived in nearby wetlands, leading to speculation that either environmental factors unique to the ridge or an unknown deterrent influenced local wildlife. The hollow was not merely a geological curiosity, it was a micro-ecosystem with anomalies that resisted easy explanation. The team sought any visible entrances by examining the ridge's outer walls, particularly where erosion had revealed fractures in the sandstone and claystone layers common to the Jorua uplands. All attempts to force access met dead ends, crevices too narrow, cliffs too sheer, and tunnels blocked by compacted soil or fallen rock. The most promising cavity, a vertical seam some 2 meters wide, yielded only an acoustic anomaly. When someone spoke near it, the voice ricocheted internally with clarity, yet disappeared entirely within the formation, leaving the speaker unsure whether the sound had escaped into the forest or dissolved into silence. Geologists speculated that the hollow might be the product of fluvial erosion under the ridge, a vast cavity created by ancient river systems that have long since rerouted underground, but no water or sediment evidence supported the hypothesis. The mountain appeared empty in every tangible sense, yet the instruments and auditory feedback suggested the presence of voids that should not have been invisible. Adding to the mystery were traces of human activity. Small rock piles, arranged with a geometry uncharacteristic of random placement, were found on terraces near the summit. Archaeologists on the expedition considered the possibility of prehistoric Amazonian inhabitants leaving ritual markers, yet the arrangement did not match any documented Marajoara or Panoan ceremonial structures. Attempts to date the deposits using charcoal fragments in nearby soil layers were inconclusive, yielding results that spanned centuries without specificity. If these markers were man-made, they suggested intentional acknowledgement of the ridge's acoustic properties, a recognition lost to time and absent from the historical record. For the expedition members, this raised an unsettling question. Had the hollow ridge always been observed and revered, or were these formations part of a natural design whose significance humans only partially understood? The hollow ridge also exerted a psychological influence on those who lingered. Team members reported a growing sense of spatial disorientation, with topographic maps failing to match perceived distances and slopes appearing steeper or shallower than they were. Compass readings remained consistent, yet the ridge seemed to warp perception, creating the sensation of walking in loops or over terrain that subtly shifted beneath one's feet. Scientists documenting these effects considered fatigue, isolation, and the high humidity, but the reports persisted, even among those acclimated to Amazonian conditions. Instruments confirmed no magnetic anomalies sufficient to account for the distortions, leaving the experience in the realm of human perception, while still acknowledging a physical trigger that remained unidentified. Despite their rigorous documentation, the Tapajos Chirrua team departed the hollow ridge with more questions than answers. Measurements, photographs, and acoustic recordings captured phenomena beyond ordinary explanation, yet every attempt to penetrate the mountain's interior failed. The region's remoteness, combined with seasonal rains that could swell the Chirrua River in days, limited return visits, cementing the ridge's reputation as a location both alluring and inaccessible. Even decades later, subsequent expeditions have confirmed the ridge's acoustic hollowness, while failing to locate any entrance or cavity large enough for human passage. Local guides continue to avoid the summit, reiterating that the hollow ridge is not for the living to enter, a statement that, while vague, carries the weight of generations' unquantifiable experience. The hollow ridge remained an enigma suspended between the tangible and the impossible, a space whose internal architecture could only be inferred through echoes and vibration, where geology and folklore entwined, and where human perception itself seemed a fragile instrument for measuring truth. As the team descended back toward the river's edge, their voices carried differently than expected, bouncing faintly in the distance yet never revealing the ridge's interior. Instruments hummed with faint anomalies, soil samples suggested nothing unusual, and the rock markers remained silent witnesses to something beyond understanding. The ridge waited, hollow, patient and indifferent, as if holding its secret for those willing to ascend but never to touch. Sounds vanished into the hollow ridge, its vast interior untouched by human intrusion, leaving only a haunting resonance that appeared to stretch time itself. The twin camps of the Negro headwaters. The Guiana Negro Survey Expedition of 1979 arrived at the upper headwaters of the Negro River under a canopy that thickened with every bend, where light barely reached the surface of the slow-moving Blackwater streams. The forest pressed in on both sides of the tributaries, its mirrored reflections making it difficult to distinguish reality from illusion. The expedition's goal was precise: to map remote portions of the river, collect ecological data, and document previously unrecorded floodplain habitats. Yet as the team pushed upriver, a subtle unease grew. Waterways converged and diverged in ways the maps did not anticipate, and the rhythm of the forest seemed slightly off-kilter, as if the landscape itself had been rearranged overnight. The mystery of the headwaters began not with a sound or sight, but with a sense that coordinates could not capture the entirety of the place. The northernmost team navigated through labyrinthine channels, carefully logging the positions of fallen trees and natural levees as they charted their route toward what they believed would be the first campsite. Their journey involved constant vigilance, as hidden snags and shallow sandbars threatened to strand their canoes in the black water's shifting tides. Botanists on the team recorded buriti palms, Mauritia flexuosa, and the occasional giant water lily, noting subtle differences in leaf coloration and route placement that might aid future navigation. They observed the way the forest floor sloped imperceptibly toward the river, creating micro-flood zones where small fish and amphibians thrived even in the rainy season. Yet nothing in their experience prepared them for the sense that the river was guiding them somewhere, or perhaps away from something unknown. Meanwhile, the southern contingent advanced along a parallel tributary, noting subtle shifts in watercolour and the density of submerged vegetation, unaware that another group mirrored their coordinates only kilometres away. They documented the occurrence of floating mats of ferns and seedlings, occasionally measuring water clarity and pH, while attempting to keep pace with the relentless current that transformed quiet pools into swirling channels without warning. Occasionally they glimpsed long-tailed capuchins leaping between branches or heard the distant tapping of woodpeckers against trunks, but the arrangement of these living markers felt oddly deliberate, as if the forest had conspired to differentiate one team's perception from the others. Every bend brought confirmation that the environment was familiar yet subtly altered, an effect that would later become central to the expedition's unexplained discrepancy. Their camp, positioned on a narrow floodplain lined with buriti palms, seemed ordinary at first, yet the shape of the river bend and the arrangement of tree roots defied all prior maps and satellite imagery. Tents were pitched on the firmest sections of sand and hammocks were strung between trees chosen for height and stability. The team recorded nocturnal activity, noting the calls of hotzins and the occasional distant roar of a jaguar, but the terrain itself seemed to resist categorization. Photographs taken at dawn revealed shadows falling differently than expected, while soil samples suggested a composition slightly richer in organic matter than the surrounding areas. To the northern team, the campsite was both a refuge and a puzzle, a place simultaneously tangible and inscrutable. Across the forest, the southern team recorded a campsite that occupied the same latitude and longitude, but featured soil composition, fallen logs, and undergrowth that contradicted the first team's meticulous notes. Whereas the northern camp had a gentle rise leading toward the river, the southern site sat upon a barely perceptible depression, and the direction of moss growth along tree trunks appeared reversed. Streams trickled in directions that no maps had predicted, and fallen branches formed natural barriers where none existed for the other team. The guides, who had lived along these waterways for decades, expressed hesitation and confusion, admitting that they had never witnessed such anomalies. Despite the identical coordinates, the two campsites could not have appeared more dissimilar to the human eye. GPS logs confirmed that both camps occupied identical coordinates, yet topographic observations, river flow patterns, and even the direction of moss growth refused to align between the two locations. Instruments calibrated to within meters showed no error, and repeated measurements eliminated drift from compass variations or satellite inconsistencies. Even aerial reconnaissance using small fixed-wing aircraft confirmed that each site existed in isolation, with the surrounding floodplain maintaining features that supported one location but contradicted the other. The phenomenon was documented with precision, yet no physical explanation emerged. What the forest presented to the northern team seemed entirely separate from what it revealed to the southern team, a living paradox suspended in space. Hydrologists suggested seasonal flooding and slight tidal influences could distort perceptions of distance and orientation, but these factors alone could not account for the total disparity in landscape features. While water levels can rise and submerge minor landmarks during rainy months, neither team was operating during peak flooding. River currents were modest, and small-scale tidal shifts could not reverse the direction of microchannels or alter the distribution of fallen trees and sediment. Climatologists agreed that temperature and humidity fluctuations might create shimmering optical effects, yet such phenomena could never explain the consistent differences in soil texture, route placement, and subtle topography between the two camps. Humidity, shifting light under dense canopy, and the repetition of similar palm groves created optical illusions that made the terrain feel mirrored, yet no team had strayed from the riverbanks recorded in their official logs. Every afternoon, sunlight slanted through the upper canopy in streaks that exaggerated depth and distance, while thick mist occasionally settled in low areas, smoothing over the contours of the forest floor. In these moments, team members described the sensation of moving through a landscape that echoed itself, yet the echoes did not align. Birds sang along one channel while remaining silent along the other. Insects droned inconsistently, and the smallest disturbances in the vegetation seemed to defy repetition. Exhaustion, isolation, and the disorienting sameness of the flooded forest weighed on both teams, causing moments of doubt as to whether memory, perception, or reality itself had begun to fracture. Journal entries from expedition members repeatedly questioned whether they were witnessing separate locations, imagining differences, or becoming victims of the forest's peculiar spatial logic. The repeated cycles of river bends, palm clusters, and sediment deposits challenged their sense of linear progression. And each night, when fires were lit and meals shared quietly in tents, a persistent unease lingered over their inability to reconcile observation with coordinates. By the time both teams returned to the main river junction, field notes and photographs documented reality in conflicting ways, leaving the explorers with a lingering sense that the forest had imposed a secret order unknown to any human. Maps depicted one reality, instruments recorded another, and the guide's collective memory offered no clarity. The paradox remained unresolved, with both camps as evidence of a truth simultaneously undeniable and impossible to grasp. Two camps existed in the same coordinates, yet the forest seemed to recognize only one, and even that truth remained elusive. The nocturnal chorus of Watuma. Night fell over the Watuma Biological Reserve with a sudden weight, pressing the forest into a stillness that seemed absolute until an unexpected layering of calls began to rise from the canopy. The dense terra firma and flooded forest merged into an indistinguishable shadow, and the team's headlamps barely pierced the humid darkness. Above the blackwater streams, the rhythmic calls of nocturnal animals created a backdrop for something entirely unfamiliar, a sequence of vocalizations that seemed deliberate, patterned, and yet impossible to trace to any known species. The forest, alive with sound, carried the voices in ways that confounded the expedition's sense of direction and perception, as though the trees themselves had become instruments in an orchestra whose score was written by unseen hands. The Watuma Biodiversity Survey expedition of 2003 had deployed mist nets, infrared cameras, and ultrasonic bat detectors along the floodplain, recording every flutter and croak with meticulous care. Each device was calibrated to capture the full range of nocturnal frequencies, from the low croaks of hyelid frogs to the ultrasonic pulses of insectivorous bats. Scientists monitored streams and ponds, cataloguing the positions of waterlogged palms and the distribution of floating vegetation, noting microhabitats where amphibians and small mammals thrived. Despite the precision of their equipment, every channel and recording seemed to hint at a sound that eluded the human ear while remaining distinctly present. Frogs called in patterned choruses from submerged terraces, insects hummed along the leaf litter, and the occasional nocturnal bird punctuated the night with measured familiar notes. Leptodactylid frogs trilled in the flooded patches, while katydids contributed high-pitched oscillations that formed intricate layers. A pair of potus called intermittently, their hollow, haunting tones echoing across the tributaries. Yet interwoven among these identifiable signals was a timbre that suggested multiplicity beyond the number of species visible or trapped by the nets. The team listened in disbelief as the night's soundscape expanded and contracted, a complex rhythm that resisted cataloguing. Amid the expected sounds, a vocal sequence emerged that did not match any species catalogued in regional field guides, a tonal layering that seemed orchestrated yet impossible to locate. Ultrasonic analysis revealed overlapping harmonics at frequencies between 2 kHz and 15 kHz, alternating with pulses in lower bass tones, creating a depth unheard in the combined calls of frogs, birds, or bats. Spectrograms displayed patterns that repeated and evolved over minutes, suggesting either an unknown species with remarkable vocal control or some phenomenon entirely outside conventional biology. Each playback only deepened the mystery, the layers seeming to converse with each other across invisible spatial boundaries. Scientists debated whether echoes, overlapping calls of multiple species, or unusual wind currents might account for the phenomenon, but every playback and recording revealed patterns too precise to be accidental. Acoustic biologists noted that the harmonics interacted in ways that indicated deliberate timing and modulation. Wind measurements showed steady, low-speed currents, insufficient to carry sounds over multiple canopy layers without distortion. Even nocturnal surveys with directional microphones failed to isolate a single source, leaving the team with an unsettling conclusion. The forest was producing a symphony that did not conform to known biological principles. Teams split to triangulate the source, placing hydrophones along tributaries and scanners in the canopy, yet the sound remained elusive, threading through the forest as if it existed independently of space. Night vision cameras revealed frogs perched in expected positions, bats gliding in predictable arcs, and insects flitting through the leaf litter, but none matched the layered vocalizations recorded. Each attempt to approach a source caused the pattern to shift, subtle changes in rhythm and pitch suggesting either intelligent manipulation or a phenomenon intrinsic to the forest itself. The investigators' methodical approaches collided with an inexplicable environmental complexity. The Uatuma Reserve's flooded forests and terra firma uplands supported a staggering diversity of nocturnal species, yet none corresponded to the multi-layered frequency that now dominated the night. Flooded Varzea terraces hosted black caimans and semi-aquatic rodents, while palm-dotted uplands supported porcupines and the occasional taira. Every known inhabitant contributed expected sounds, but the anomaly defied identification even as it harmonized seamlessly with the natural chorus. Each new recording confirmed the richness of the habitat, while simultaneously highlighting a phenomenon that existed outside it, a layered resonance that could not be explained by catalogued fauna or environmental acoustics alone. The chorus exerted a subtle influence on perception, causing team members to hesitate mid-step, misjudge distances, and feel certain that multiple unseen presences moved in tandem with the sound. Fatigue and isolation compounded the effect. The repetition of similar vegetation patterns and mirrored reflections off the black water made spatial awareness unreliable. Some researchers noted the sensation that the sound responded to movement, changing tone and structure as though aware of observation. Anxiety rose with each playback, a mixture of scientific curiosity and primal unease as the forest seemed to communicate with a complexity far beyond comprehension. Previous expeditions in the Upper Amazon recorded unusual night calls, but field notes from the 1960s and 1970s contain nothing approaching the complexity and coordination heard here. Percy Fawcett's surveys along nearby tributaries reported voices in the forest that seemed human, though no instruments existed to measure them. Subsequent ecological studies noted irregular nocturnal choruses, but the multi-layered structure recorded in Uatuma remained unprecedented. By comparing historic data with modern equipment, the team confirmed that the sounds were not only genuine but unique to this location and moment. By dawn, the scientists reviewed the night's recordings in silence, each track revealing layers of sound that defied known taxonomy and left every researcher questioning the limits of observation. Tapes and spectrograms were meticulously labelled and archived, yet every file reiterated the same truth. The nocturnal chorus could not be fully explained. Some suggested undiscovered species, others hinted at emergent ecological phenomena, and a few quietly wondered whether the forest itself was producing sound with deliberate intent. Despite expertise and exhaustive effort, the anomaly remained a mystery, imprinted in the minds of those who had heard it firsthand. The nocturnal chorus persisted long after the team withdrew, a hidden symphony whose origin remained as impenetrable as the forest itself. The driftwood monolith of Madeira. Along the broad sweep of the Madeira River, the team of the 2011 Madeira Hydrobiological Survey spotted an enormous object moving upriver, its contours sharp and almost deliberate against the sluggish current. The river, swollen by seasonal rains, bore a dense load of silt and floating debris, yet this timber structure defied all expectations, gliding with a motion that contradicted the downstream flow. Its presence was immediately compelling. The team had navigated these waters for weeks, familiar with natural logs, tangled root mats, and the occasional uprooted palm, but nothing had suggested a form so uniform, so unyielding, yet drifting upstream as though propelled by some unseen force. The early morning haze clung to the water's surface, refracting light in such a way that the monolith's shadow seemed both present and absent, an impossible object suspended between clarity and uncertainty. Initial observations suggested a timber structure far larger and straighter than any natural log, stretching over 10 meters in length and seemingly carved rather than broken. Its girth rivaled the largest mahogany or kapok trunks recorded in regional surveys, and subtle angles hinted at human intervention, though no tool marks were immediately visible from the riverbank. Team members estimated its weight at several tons, yet it moved with an elegance incompatible with such mass. Floating debris was common along the Madeira, but the regularity and linearity of this object, combined with its upriver trajectory, challenged every precedent in hydrology or forest ecology known to the expedition. The Madeira's brown waters, swollen from rainfall and tributary influx, carried sediment dense enough to obscure even the largest submerged structures. Seasonal flood levels could reach 10 meters above normal, producing turbulent currents, yet even these forces were inadequate to account for the monolith's direction. Previous hydrological studies documented drift patterns during high water, and extensive mapping showed that debris invariably moved downstream or pooled in eddies, never ascending the main channel. Birds and fish adjusted instinctively to these currents, yet the object slid upriver with an imperceptible defiance of natural law, glinting faintly under streaks of sunlight filtering through the canopy. Ropes and small boats were deployed in an attempt to secure the object, but each maneuver revealed the river's latent power. Even as the team approached, subtle shifts in the current nudged the monolith aside, and the water's opaque surface masked the riverbed, creating the impression that the timber was floating in isolation above invisible supports. Canoes strained against both gravity and river flow, yet the driftwood seemed almost aware of the effort, evading capture with a precision that confounded logic. Each failed attempt magnified the anomaly, forcing the team to reconsider whether this was a natural occurrence or an inexplicable intervention in the landscape. Sonar scans, water flow measurements, and photographic documentation were employed to study the driftwood, yet each instrument only added layers of confusion. Sonar revealed a uniform density inconsistent with typical river debris, and GPS tracking registered subtle lateral movement unaccounted for by current patterns. Photographs taken from multiple angles indicated edges and protrusions that suggested careful shaping rather than random fracture. Even water conductivity and temperature readings, recorded along the monolith's path, failed to indicate an influence sufficient to produce upriver motion. Every attempt to reduce the phenomenon to measurable forces only highlighted its intransigence. Hydrologists suggested rare flood surges or submerged root networks might account for upriver movement, but calculations of current speed, water density, and object buoyancy indicated these forces were insufficient. Flood history in the region, including events in 2005 and 2009, showed that only extremely turbulent waters could lift debris in irregular directions, and such surges had not occurred in the weeks preceding the sighting. Local river guides offered folklore of upriver floating timber spirits, often describing similar shapes appearing after heavy rains, yet these accounts, though intriguing, failed to provide an empirical explanation. The expedition's documentation, precise and methodical, left only the stark conclusion that the monolith's behaviour was without precedent. River dolphins, herons, and caimans moved warily around the drifting timber, their instincts attuned to the peculiar disturbance. Dolphins altered their swimming paths to avoid contact, while herons circled above with measured caution. Even caimans, normally indifferent to logs and vegetation, shifted slightly downstream. These subtle animal reactions added an eerie dimension, suggesting that the anomaly was registered instinctively by species attuned to millennia of river patterns, as though the forest and water themselves recognized the object's incongruity. As the survey team pursued it downstream, the object slipped into a narrow channel obscured by overhanging vegetation, vanishing before it could be secured or fully examined. Sunlight glinted off the water momentarily, revealing nothing but murky reflection and drifting leaves, and by the time the canoes approached, only the faintest ripple indicated the passage of the monolith. No anchor, no tow line, and no current measurement could account for its disappearance. The river returned to its usual rhythm, yet the memory of the object's impossible course remained vivid, etched into the minds of the observers. Scientists speculated on historical accounts of floating structures and upriver anomalies, comparing the monolith to centuries-old reports of massive logs moving against the current, yet none matched the precision or apparent intent observed here. Archival records mentioned similar driftwood sightings along smaller tributaries, often dismissed as exaggeration, yet the Madeira's magnitude and force made this event exceptional. Oral histories from riverside communities described wooden spirits that travelled unseen against the flow, but these remained folklore in the absence of verifiable measurement. The juxtaposition of methodical observation and unexplainable occurrence created tension between scientific reasoning and the unquantifiable mystery of the river. Records, photographs, and GPS data captured only fragments of the monolith's passage, leaving the expedition with evidence that raised more questions than it answered. Every instrument pointed to anomaly. Mass, shape, movement, and disappearance defied natural explanation. The object's brief presence illuminated the extraordinary capacity of the Amazonian rivers to confound expectation and challenged the assumption that every phenomenon could be accounted for by known physical laws. For days, the team retraced the river, searching for further traces, yet the Madeira had resumed its normal rhythm, leaving only logs, leaves, and an inexplicable void in the channel. By the time it disappeared beyond sight, the driftwood monolith had become an unsolved enigma, a silent visitor from a river whose secrets flowed faster than any team could follow. The Watchers of Pico da Neblina. Figures appeared in the mist, motionless and unnervingly still, and the climbers of the 2014 Brazilian Amazon Alpine Survey felt an immediate sense of impossibility at what they were seeing. The shapes stood along the ridge in poses so deliberate that any casual observer might have assumed human presence, yet no campfires, tracks, or sounds accompanied them. Clouds thickened and swirled around the quartzitic slopes, blurring the edges of vision, but even through binoculars, the watchers maintained proportions that suggested awareness, a silent acknowledgement of the climber's presence without motion or sound. The summit, perched at nearly 3,000 metres, seemed both impossibly distant from the lowland forest and yet intimately connected to it by the twisting mist, and the first instinct of the team was disbelief tempered with a cautious curiosity. Binoculars were raised, thermal cameras activated, and altimeters checked repeatedly as the climbers strained to determine whether the watchers were solid forms or illusions of light and fog. Each instrument, from high-resolution cameras to handheld infrared scanners, produced results that deepened the mystery. The lenses captured outlines of shifting grey against the cloud, but thermal readings reported only the cold air and rock beneath. GPS coordinates of each observer were logged meticulously, in part to confirm location and altitude, but also to map the watchers' positions, revealing that the apparitions seemed to move independently of the climber's approach. Each careful measurement, instead of resolving the anomaly, added an intangible weight to the silence that surrounded the ridge. Mist hung thick over the quartzitic ridges, and wind gusts swept across steep slopes, bending moss and ferns while obscuring precise details of the figures in a constantly shifting tableau. The endemic flora, dense and moisture-laden, dripped with condensation, creating curtains of green that both framed and partially concealed the watchers. Light filtered weakly through the mist, producing shadows that warped against the craggy stone, yet these were inadequate to explain the repeated humanoid forms that appeared along multiple vantage points. Even the sun's diffuse illumination seemed complicit, highlighting the watchers' contours in a way that suggested presence beyond mere rock or cloud. As the climbers adjusted their positions, the figures remained, recurring at intervals along the ridgeline, their proportions seeming humanoid yet registering no heat on any instruments. Shifting vantage points failed to clarify their nature. Approaching from one side caused the figures to vanish from view, only for them to reappear at a new location along the jagged ridge. The pattern suggested intentionality, or at least consistent placement, contradicting explanations of random shadows or momentary illusions. Each observer's perception aligned, lending credibility to the reports and leaving the team confronted with a phenomenon that science could measure yet not define. Eyes strained against fog, minds questioned the reliability of perception, and the thin air at nearly 3,000 meters amplified every sense, making the watchers feel both vividly present and maddeningly intangible. The altitude, combined with exertion and low oxygen, heightened the climbers' sensitivity to visual stimuli, producing an almost hallucinatory intensity in their awareness. Yet despite these physiological stressors, multiple team members independently confirmed the watchers' repeated appearances. Fatigue and perception alone could not account for the precise geometry, scale and movement, or rather, the persistent immobility of the forms observed across the ridge. Photographs, GPS data and thermal readings were analysed in real time, yet each device produced only partial echoes of the watchers, as though the sensors themselves hesitated to confirm their existence. Cameras captured faint grey outlines, sometimes distorted by fog, while thermal scanners reported nothing beyond ambient rock and wind-chilled air. Altimeter readings confirmed that the climbers were on stable ridges, ruling out optical illusions created by perspective or uneven terrain. Attempts to triangulate the watchers' positions with multiple cameras revealed discrepancies, as if the figures existed only partially within observable space, resisting complete documentation. Quartzite formations, erosion patterns and cloud shadows were considered, but the repeated positions of the figures and their apparent awareness of the climbers challenged every natural explanation. Pico da Neblina's sandstone and quartzitic ridges occasionally form sharp spires and rounded humps that can mimic humanoid shapes, yet these features are fixed, immobile, and typically irregular in proportion. The watchers, in contrast, appeared to maintain consistent form while reappearing along the ridge in locations that could not be predicted by natural topography alone. Even the wind, capable of creating transient optical illusions with mist and cloud, failed to account for the persistence and clarity of the sightings. Even after climbing higher along the ridge, the watchers persisted in the peripheral vision of multiple team members, appearing and disappearing as if tethered to the mist itself. The climbers noted that each encounter lasted only a few minutes at a time, yet recurred across multiple vantage points and over hours, suggesting a temporal as well as spatial anomaly. Attempts to photograph the figures with varied exposure settings yielded only blurry shapes, sometimes superimposed over rock, sometimes floating against a backdrop of cloud. The ambiguity of these recordings frustrated the team's scientific expectations, emphasizing the gap between observation and comprehension in extreme Amazonian environments. Climbers discussed old expedition logs and local oral histories, which spoke of ghostly figures and shifting shapes along Pico da Neblina, yet no record matched the clarity, scale, or persistence of what they had witnessed. Local accounts described spirits of the mountain, or figures appearing in dense fog, but these tales were anecdotal and lacked precise coordinates or corroborating instruments. Modern climbing records and high-altitude surveys rarely mention humanoid sightings, and none reported repeated observations by multiple trained observers, as the 2014 Alpine Survey team had documented. The juxtaposition of folklore and measured data deepened the sense of mystery, highlighting the ridge as a place where perception and legend intersect. Descending towards lower altitudes, the climbers reviewed their images and notes, finding no confirmable evidence. Yet the memory of the watchers lingered with a clarity that defied both science and reason. Instruments could not validate what the eye had seen, and no hypothesis fully reconciled the repeated appearances of figures that responded in some inexplicable way to the observers themselves. Each climber carried the same uneasy certainty. Something on the ridge had observed them as intently as they had observed it, leaving an imprint of presence that technology could not erase. The ridge emptied of motion, but the watchers remained, suspended somewhere between perception and reality, leaving the summit haunted by a presence no instrument could capture. The flightless shadows of Mamirawa. Researchers adjusted sonar and infrared cameras along the flooded channels of Mamirawa, meticulously scanning the water and canopy for patterns that might reveal previously undocumented nocturnal species. The Mamirawa Institute had organised the survey to catalogue elusive fauna in the Agapo forest, where seasonal flooding transforms lowland terrain into an intricate network of waterways. Instruments whirred softly, and the soft splash of paddles against submerged roots provided the only immediate auditory markers. Every sweep of the sonar revealed undulating reflections, but a few distortions resisted categorization, hinting at something beyond the known ecosystem. Data points flickered across the monitors, ripples and distortions inconsistent with wind, submerged vegetation, or fish movements, suggesting anomalies the team could neither immediately identify nor attribute to instrumentation error. Each pulse and return was logged, coordinates cross-checked, and the margins of error noted meticulously. Even the most cautious researchers could not dismiss the persistence of patterns that repeatedly appeared along different sections of the flooded channels. The sensors, though precise, only reinforced the unease that some presence lingered just beyond empirical detection. Team members exchanged cautious glances as mist rose from submerged vegetation, torchlight reflecting off dark waters, while the dense forest murmured with frogs, insects, and the occasional call of nocturnal birds. The smell of decaying leaves mixed with the pungent scent of wet soil and waterlogged wood, adding to the oppressive sensation that the forest itself was watching. Shadows moved unpredictably across floating vegetation, and the biologists began to note discrepancies between the instruments and what their eyes reported. Each observer experienced moments when movement seemed palpable in the periphery, vanishing whenever attention was focused directly. A fleeting shadow passed along a channel, gliding in a manner unlike any familiar river creature. Though torches tracked it, nothing emerged in the water. No sound broke the silence, and thermal scanners failed to record any heat signature. The team paused, considering the possibility of illusions created by torchlight on floating debris, but repeated appearances contradicted this explanation. Every attempted approach was met with vanishing shapes, leaving researchers grasping for rational explanations while recording detailed field notes. Sonar pulses were repeated at varying angles, and cameras captured long exposures, yet the dark forms eluded precise capture. Sometimes, a shadow would appear to glide across open water, at other times moving over logs or the bank in ways inconsistent with any known terrestrial or aquatic species. The team attempted to triangulate the anomalies with multiple cameras, but discrepancies persisted, suggesting the shadows were neither fixed nor entirely bound by the observable environment. Each new observation intensified the challenge of separating perception from reality. Over multiple sections of the flooded forest, the shadows reappeared with subtle consistency, moving against currents and over floating vegetation in patterns that suggested intent. The researchers began to notice repeated spatial alignments, shadows recurring near particular tree clusters or along channels where the current should have carried floating logs in predictable ways. Even the seasonal rise and fall of the waters, which reshape nearly every aspect of the Igapo forest, could not account for these movements. Each encounter was carefully logged, providing a growing pattern that eluded conventional ecological interpretation. The reserve teems with nocturnal creatures, giant river otters, capybaras, spectacled caimans, and forest birds, yet none exhibited the size, silent glide, or flightless but fluid movement witnessed by the team. Observers were careful to account for familiar species, cataloguing known behavior and movement patterns, yet the anomalies failed to match any recognized animal. Even in a region celebrated for biological diversity, the shadow-like forms defied classification, their presence acknowledged only through indirect observation and fleeting glimpses. Exertion and isolation heightened every sense. The researchers felt the shadows both through vision and an unsettling impression of being watched in return. Breathing became noticeable in the humid air, the paddle's rhythmic splashes echoed differently against still waters, and the rustle of submerged vegetation produced a sense of anticipation. Minds, sharpened by intense focus, vacillated between scientific reasoning and the creeping unease of witnessing something inexplicable. Every movement of the shadows seemed deliberate, creating a tension that lingered with each observation. Logs, footage, and sonar data were reviewed repeatedly, revealing anomalies that persisted without explanation. While no single image or recording provided conclusive evidence, the cumulative data confirmed the consistency of the phenomenon across multiple researchers and instruments. Patterns emerged in the shadows' movements, their trajectories suggesting controlled glides and avoidance of obstacles. Yet all attempts to identify a species failed. The uncertainty became central to the experience, blending the rigor of scientific documentation with the enigmatic quality of the unknown. By dawn, the water surface calmed and torches were extinguished, yet the memory of forms that had moved deliberately, silently, and beyond understanding lingered in every mind. Instruments had failed to capture definitive evidence. Local knowledge offered only folklore and indirect reports, and even the careful scientific logs could not reconcile the repeated anomalies. The biologists left the flooded forest with the certainty that something had moved deliberately through the channels, yet eluded the reach of observation, existing at the boundary between knowledge and conjecture. The shadows had vanished, but the forest seemed to pulse with the quiet certainty that something unseen had traversed its waters in ways no human could track or predict. The Pathfinders of the Solomos. The Solomos River Survey of 2017 set out to map forgotten waterways and document indigenous trade routes, but early into the floodplain the team discovered a series of stone markers whose presence defied any known records of human construction. Their mission, organised by the Brazilian National Institute for Amazonian Research, aimed to reconcile satellite imagery with local oral histories of long-abandoned paths. Yet as the small boat crept along braided channels, it became clear that the markers were not incidental debris or natural outcrops. Each stone had been deliberately placed, its position hinting at a knowledge of geometry and planning unrecorded in the historical accounts of the region. Dense igapo forests stretched in every direction, their submerged roots and waterlogged soil complicating navigation and forcing the researchers to combine GPS coordinates with painstaking on-foot surveys along muddy embankments. The seasonal flooding that transforms the Solomos into a vast network of waterways had altered the landscape considerably, leaving channels wider in some sections and entirely blocked in others. Researchers had to adjust their course frequently, marking every bend, fallen tree and submerged log to ensure the survey data remained accurate. Every step into the soft mud reminded them of the difficulty of tracing human traces in such a fluid environment. The first marker rose just above the floodwaters, roughly hewn yet deliberate, its placement suggesting alignment and purpose that seemed impossible in such a remote and dynamic landscape. It was a rectangular block, perhaps a metre in length, partially submerged, its surface smoothed in places while retaining jagged edges in others. The positioning relative to a neighbouring tree and a channel bend seemed intentional, as though the marker was meant to be seen from multiple vantage points along the river. Observers crouched on the muddy bank, measuring angles and noting orientations, their curiosity tempered by the impossibility of explaining why stone had been used in a region where timber and earth were the customary building materials. Researchers sketched the marker's dimensions, recorded its orientation, and examined the stone's composition, noting subtle grooves that hinted at human shaping rather than natural erosion. They compared the texture against the basalt and sandstone common to upland areas, realizing the stones had likely been transported from distant riverbeds, suggesting an effort and intention beyond ordinary construction. Each notch and indentation was documented, photographs taken at multiple exposures, and even the smallest detail was logged in the field journal. Instruments like laser rangefinders were employed to ensure measurements could be cross-checked later, but the anomaly's significance could not be captured fully in technical data alone. As the team progressed upriver, similar markers appeared at regular intervals, their spacing and alignment hinting at a coordinated system spanning kilometres of forested floodplain. Patterns emerged in the arrangement. Stones often marked points where waterways intersected or bends in the river suggested navigational importance. The repetition was uncanny, and while some markers were partially hidden beneath mud and water, the overall continuity indicated a network that had once guided movement or conveyed meaning to those who placed them. This system persisted through areas where no known pre-Columbian settlements existed, amplifying the sense of historical mystery. They considered sediment deposits, root formations, and accidental arrangements of stones by river currents, but none of these natural processes could account for the consistency and geometric precision of the markers. Even the flood's strong currents, capable of carrying trees and debris for hundreds of meters, could not explain the precise placement, alignment, and spacing observed. Detailed comparisons were made against aerial imagery and historical topography, eliminating the likelihood of coincidence. The markers seemed to assert human intention where no human activity had previously been recorded. Pre-Columbian cultures in the Solomos region were known to build in wood and earth, yet no archaeological record indicated that stone markers of this size or arrangement had ever existed here. Historical texts and indigenous oral histories mentioned ceremonial pathways, trade networks, and sacred sites, but stone construction was largely absent from documented practice in this lowland region. Scholars consulted by the team were baffled, suggesting possibilities ranging from forgotten civilizations to ephemeral ritualistic installations, now lost to sedimentation and flooding. The contrast between established knowledge and the evidence before the survey team created a tension that lingered throughout the expedition. Heat, humidity, and swarms of mosquitoes weighed on the team, magnifying the sense of isolation and wonder as they documented each marker with care, knowing that the significance of their discovery might never be fully understood. The combination of environmental strain and the sheer scale of the floodplain heightened their awareness, sharpening both observation and imagination. Each step across the mud and each paddle stroke brought the researchers into closer contact with a landscape that seemed alive with memory, yet resistant to interpretation. Fatigue was tempered by the thrill of uncovering traces that had evaded human attention for centuries. By mapping the markers' positions and comparing them across the floodplain, the team realized that their distribution suggested a network of paths or ceremonial routes, yet one completely absent from historical records. The recurrence of similar alignments, occasionally forming geometric patterns when viewed from higher ground, implied purpose beyond utilitarian navigation. Yet no accompanying artifacts, pottery shards, tools, or structural remains provided context. The mystery of the stone's origin, purpose, and builders deepened with every discovery, defying conventional archaeological explanation. Even with meticulous logs, photographs, and sketches, the markers resisted explanation, leaving the researchers with a growing sense that the floodplain held secrets older than any documented settlement. The combination of environmental change, lost history, and human oversight had preserved the markers while erasing all context. Each stone, carefully measured and logged, carried with it a silent testimony of a human presence that had vanished from memory, leaving only the physical trace of deliberate intention embedded in the land. The stones remained, unmoving and inscrutable, as if the land itself had preserved a story that no living witness could ever read. The river that fell silent. For miles along the Solomos, water churned and swirled as if guided by hidden currents, yet the usual roar of rapids was curiously absent, leaving the river eerily neutral in tone. Waves broke over submerged rocks, eddies spun in familiar patterns, and fallen trees jostled with the current, yet the sound that should accompany such motion had vanished entirely. The river's surface reflected the dappled sunlight filtering through the dense canopy, yet the expected splashes, bubbles, and murmurs of moving water were conspicuously missing. Observers familiar with Amazonian rivers could not reconcile the visual evidence with the absence of its auditory counterpart, and for the first time, the Solomos seemed to exist independently of its own voice. Fish leapt in their usual rhythm, tails slapping the water with audible energy, and birds swooped low, scattering in alarm, yet the usual impact sounds blended into nothingness. Even the insects, whose buzzing normally merged with water noise to create the river's persistent hum, seemed amplified only in isolation, highlighting the river's unnatural quiet. Researchers on a nearby tributary, tracking water levels and sediment, first noticed the discrepancy as an absence, a silence so pronounced that the ambient sounds of forest and fauna seemed artificially loud. Every sensory expectation was challenged, as if the river had subtracted the one element that defined its presence in the mind. When the first canoe approached, paddles barely disturbed the surface. No splash announced their progress. No gurgle echoed off the banks. The motion of the water should have created turbulence and sound, yet it accommodated the canoe silently, as though aware of human intrusion but choosing to remain mute. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, instinct telling them that something fundamental had shifted, though all visual indicators, the current, the eddies, the floating detritus, pointed to normal flow. It was a river in motion, yet absent of the one thing they associated with life, its sound. The silence extended across miles, confirming that this was no localized quirk of riverbed or seasonal debris. As they advanced, ripples formed and spread, bubbles broke the surface, yet their presence was unaccompanied by any acoustic signature. Every submerged stone, every submerged branch that should have clattered and hissed, remained invisible in the realm of sound. The crew began to hypothesize, questioning whether some unusual sediment density, surface tension anomaly, or water temperature gradient could dampen noise so completely. Instruments were deployed to measure depth, current, and vibration, but the data only confirmed the impossibility. The river moved as usual, yet the sound was gone. Ripples and eddies danced with their usual patterns, yet the acoustic absence persisted. Hydrophones recorded no audible disturbance. Sonar, sensitive to the minutest vibration, detected normal water movement, yet delivered nothing interpretable in human hearing. Observers tried striking the surface with sticks, dropping rocks into the current, even attempting to clap and shout across the water. None produced more than the faintest echo of normal expectation. The river had become its own instrument of defiance, visually alive yet acoustically null. Local elders spoke in hushed tones of stretches that sleep, where water moves without voice, a phenomenon rarely witnessed and even less frequently discussed outside traditional knowledge. Some called it the river's way of hiding its secrets. Others described guardian spirits who muted waters to protect sacred passages or prevent intrusion. These stories, once dismissed as metaphor, suddenly carried weight in the face of physical observation. When shared with the expedition team, the accounts provided context but no solution, layering mystery upon anomaly. The elders' descriptions aligned curiously with the observed stretch, from the meandering channel at the river's bend to the submerged trees and floodplain islands that punctuated its route. Attempts to provoke a response produced none. Splashes of debris, the rhythmic sound of paddles, and even deliberate sonic pulses from small portable speakers yielded no more than visual disturbance. The river's current continued to swirl, eddy and churn, yet it refused to communicate in any familiar way. Scientists began to contemplate whether the silence was an atmospheric effect, a unique hydrological event, or something entirely unrecorded in Amazonian natural history. The contrast between flowing water and absent sound remained so stark that it forced a reconsideration of expectation itself. Rivers, as carriers of life and noise, had a defined auditory signature, and here it had vanished. As night approached, faint light glimmered on the surface, reflecting the surrounding canopy and fading sky, yet the anomaly remained unchanged. Instruments were left running overnight to track water flow, acoustic patterns, and environmental variables. The data confirmed consistency, yet all aligned on a single unexplainable fact. The river sounded like a muted version of itself. Crew members reported heightened awareness. Every rustle of leaves, insect buzz, and bird call amplified in contrast, underscoring the absence of the river's voice. The phenomenon seemed to stretch time as well as space, leaving an impression that the anomaly existed beyond a simple environmental cause. Morning revealed the Solomos flowing steadily, sediment drifting along its course, entirely normal to the eye, yet its acoustic void remained. The river had removed something intrinsic from its behaviour, and while all measurements indicated normal hydrology, the crew was left with a tension between observable truth and experiential reality. This section of the river resisted human understanding, a natural feature that defied expectations and instruments alike, holding its secrets silently beneath ripples and current. From riverbed to surface, the water had vanished into silence, leaving behind a quiet impossibility beyond the understanding of any observer. The compass spiral of Guapor. The Guapor mapping expedition of 2022 had been tasked with charting unrecorded tributaries, yet the first day in the forest revealed that even simple instruments might not obey expectation. The team carried compasses, maps, and GPS devices, intending to confirm river channels and mark key floodplain features, but the instruments themselves seemed to suggest an alternative reality. Where watercourses should align with magnetic north, small but consistent deviations began to appear, a subtle unease forming as each reading contradicted prior knowledge. At first, observers attributed the anomalies to inexperience or calibration error, yet there was a precision in the discrepancies that suggested something far more unusual. A compass, carefully aligned to true north, began to rotate slowly, tracing a path that no earthly force should compel, and the observer's brow furrowed at the impossible motion. The needle's spiral was gradual but unmistakable, circling in a consistent rhythm that resisted explanation. Even as hands steadied and recalibrated it, the device refused to rest. continuing a silent, invisible pattern across its face. It was as though the forest itself imposed a hidden geometry, bending instruments to an unknown logic, indifferent to human understanding. Geological surveys of the region indicated iron-rich soil and occasional magnetic anomalies, but nothing in prior research could account for the synchronized spirals now displayed by multiple instruments. The Guapore Basin is known for occasional lodestones and alluvial deposits containing iron and manganese, which can locally influence compasses, yet the patterns observed here extended across several kilometers and involved instruments separated by metal-free zones. The anomaly's scale far exceeded anything documented in regional geomagnetic studies, defying conventional understanding and hinting at a phenomenon that resisted simple explanation. Technicians swapped compasses, removed them from metal tools and recalibrated repeatedly, yet each device performed identically, as though responding to a hidden rhythm beneath the forest floor. Every precaution, plastic housings, distance from equipment and repeated checks, was carefully applied, but the spiraling motion persisted. It became evident that the anomaly was neither a mechanical fault nor a human error, leaving the expedition to confront a reality in which natural laws seemed selectively suspended. The instruments themselves, designed for precision and reliability, had become evidence of something entirely alien to standard navigation. Maps, landmarks, and GPS readings contradicted the compass's rotation, creating a dissonance between known geography and inexplicable direction, and forcing the team to question the limits of perception itself. River bends that should have corresponded to a northward course now fell at odd angles, and the careful triangulation of landmarks produced inconsistent results. The explorers, trained to rely on these tools for survival and accuracy, found their expectations repeatedly frustrated. Even the sky, with its familiar celestial cues, provided no remedy. The anomaly persisted independently of orientation, as though the very concept of direction had been subtly warped. Nearby soil samples and magnetic field measurements showed nothing unusual, and even the occasional presence of iron-rich rocks failed to explain the scale and precision of the spiraling pattern. Portable magnetometers confirmed only minimal field fluctuations, insufficient to account for the measured deviations. The team noted that the anomaly affected each compass identically, whether on riverbanks, in open floodplains, or beneath dense canopy. It was a spatial irregularity that seemed to exist in 3 dimensions, influencing instruments regardless of surroundings, defying conventional theories about localized magnetic disturbance. Local elders recounted stories of travelers who became hopelessly disoriented along this stretch of river, tales of guiding spirits or hidden forces that twisted not only paths but perception itself. They spoke of paths that folded back upon themselves, landmarks that appeared and disappeared, and compasses that refused to obey the hand. These oral histories, once dismissed as metaphor, now resonated with the expedition team, suggesting a long-observed but unrecorded phenomenon. The intersection of modern instrumentation and traditional knowledge created a narrative in which science and folklore both pointed towards something genuinely inexplicable. Anxieties grew as the spirals continued, each rotation a reminder that human instruments could be deceived, and that the forest's unseen mechanisms might operate on rules beyond logic or measurement. Observers became increasingly aware of a cognitive dissonance, the strain of reconciling empirical knowledge with repeated visual contradiction. Even experienced navigators felt an unsettling doubt, aware that their most trusted tools, the compasses and maps that had guided countless journeys, could not be relied upon here. The forest seemed to assert its own rules, and the anomaly acted as a subtle but insistent teacher of humility. Every attempt to force alignment, adjusting bearings, consulting maps, or retracing steps only reinforced the anomaly's persistence, leaving the team suspended between certainty and doubt. Each failed measurement, each incongruent reading deepened the sense that the Guapore region held secrets inaccessible to conventional methods. Repetition did not clarify, it compounded the mystery, making it clear that the spirals were not random but followed some hidden logic the human mind could not easily comprehend. The expedition, though prepared for challenges of navigation, climate and wildlife, now faced a test of perception itself. With the sun sinking behind distant hills, the compasses traced slow, perfect arcs, while the forest appeared to watch, indifferent to explanation or human frustration. Twilight shadows lengthened, reflecting off water and leaves, yet the instruments traced the same deliberate circles, unaffected by fading light or human intervention. Even the most skeptical team members felt a growing reverence for the anomaly, recognizing it as a phenomenon beyond simple cause and effect. The forest remained silent, holding its secret beneath the canopy, soil and river, leaving only observation and speculation in its wake. The compasses spun on their invisible axis, tracing circles that no hand or star could ever explain, leaving the forest itself to guard a secret no map could capture. The reef that shouldn't exist. At extreme low tide, the riverbed revealed a jagged formation that seemed impossible in fresh water, and only later did the Madeira River Survey team realise the significance of what they were seeing. Initially, the outline appeared as little more than scattered stones emerging from silt, but as the team approached with binoculars and wading poles, the scale became unmistakable. The structure stretched across several hundred metres, forming sharp ridges and irregular mounds that should not exist in this part of the Amazon. Its presence contradicted every prior map, chart and river survey, raising immediate questions that the team would struggle to answer for days. Ridges of compacted stone and sediment rose sharply from the river, forming patterns too regular to be natural silt deposits, yet entirely submerged for most of the year. Even beneath the shallow, murky water, the formation suggested deliberate placement, or a process far more ordered than random river accumulation. Sunlight catching the crests revealed geometric shapes, reminiscent of reef structures along the Atlantic coast, though here they lay hundreds of kilometres upriver from the nearest saltwater. Small channels and pockets of water threaded between the ridges, creating miniature labyrinths that the team could not immediately explain. Reef structures require saline water and stable marine substrates, conditions absent here, yet the formation mirrored the geometry and texture of coral reefs seen in the Atlantic hundreds of kilometres away. The Madeira River carries massive sediment loads, with deposits of clay, silt and sand that shift seasonally during flooding. But these materials typically produce smooth, featureless beds rather than rigid, protruding ridges. Researchers were familiar with sediment bars and emergent islands, yet none exhibited the structural coherence observed in this formation. Its very existence suggested either an unknown natural process or a phenomenon that defied conventional understanding. Underwater photography and sonar mapping revealed interconnected ridges and hollows, each feature exhibiting a precision that defied explanation from natural river sedimentation alone. Sonar pulses returned clear echoes, outlining peaks and depressions that extended more than 50 metres in length and up to 3 metres in height. Digital images captured from submerged cameras showed dense, stone-like structures arranged in parallel lines and angles, some nearly straight, others curving gracefully as though following a hidden plane. These findings challenged everything the team knew about freshwater river morphology, leaving them simultaneously awed and unsettled. Analysis of river silt and clay confirmed a purely freshwater composition, providing no chemical trace of the oceanic conditions necessary for reef formation. Laboratory tests revealed high levels of silica and aluminum, typical of the Amazon basin, but no trace of calcium carbonate or other marine-derived minerals that characterize coral growth. The team noted that this suggested the reef had formed entirely in situ, under conditions where biology, chemistry and hydrology should have prevented its creation. Each data point deepened the puzzle, hinting at processes that science had yet to identify in one of the most studied rivers in the world. No archival maps, satellite imagery or nautical charts marked any permanent structure at these coordinates, suggesting either a newly emergent phenomenon or one that had gone entirely unnoticed for decades. Imagery from Landsat and Sentinel satellites confirmed a consistent pattern of submerged terrain, invisible for most of the year, appearing only during periods of extreme low water. Historical accounts from explorers in the early 20th century mentioned shifting sandbars and temporary islands, but made no mention of permanent reef-like ridges. The anomaly had likely existed for centuries, hidden beneath the river's fluctuating surface, awaiting a moment when conditions would allow its discovery. Fishermen spoke of ghost islands that emerged in low water, warning that certain river stretches were treacherous and should not be disturbed, their stories blending caution with awe. According to local accounts, these formations occasionally appeared during exceptionally dry years, and navigating near them brought sudden, unexplained currents that could capsize small boats. The team listened intently to such oral histories, realizing that human memory and observation, passed down through generations, had long preserved knowledge of the anomaly that modern science had overlooked. This intersection of folklore and discovery lent the reef a sense of hidden agency, as though it existed not only physically but in collective consciousness. Even with careful measurement and repeated observation, the researchers could only acknowledge the reef as real, and yet entirely inexplicable within existing ecological and geological frameworks. Each methodical check, survey lines, sediment core samples and sonar passes, confirmed the formation's presence, but offered no answer to how or why it had formed. Standard processes of river sediment deposition, erosion, and biological growth could not replicate the structure's ordered features. The anomaly persisted as a stark reminder that, in the Amazon, human knowledge is continually provisional, subject to the river's ancient and enigmatic rhythms. Excitement gave way to unease as the team debated whether the formation was an undiscovered geological phenomenon or something that challenged their fundamental understanding of the Amazon's freshwater systems. Could an unknown type of sedimentary process account for such regularity? Might submerged organisms contribute to its stability? Or did the reef hint at forces entirely beyond contemporary science? These questions remained unanswered, leaving the team to balance empirical curiosity with the humility that comes when nature refuses to be fully mapped or tamed. As the tide slowly returned, concealing the reef beneath opaque water, its impossible outline lingered in memory, defying explanation or dismissal. Even when no longer visible, the shadows of the ridges haunted the minds of those who had seen them firsthand, a silent monument to the Amazon's capacity for the unexpected. Every attempt to reconcile observation with known processes only reinforced the reef's mystery, and the river continued its flow, indifferent to human understanding. Beneath the murky river water, the reef held its silent dominion, an impossible formation that no hand, map, or memory could ever explain. The distant machinery of Xingu. A metallic grinding reverberated through the dense canopy, rhythmic and utterly out of place, each pulse slicing through the usual quiet of the forest. Only after several minutes did the team of the Xingu River Basin Expedition realize the sound came from no known source. At first, it could have been dismissed as some unusual convergence of branches or distant animal movement, yet the cadence and tonal quality were unmistakably artificial. The researchers paused on the narrow trail, listening, eyes scanning the shadowed undergrowth for any sign of human activity or the glint of metal. But the forest remained undisturbed and indifferent. Only the sound persisted, steady, low, and deliberate, echoing in a way that made the thick green canopy itself seem alive with a mechanical pulse. The grinding was low and resonant, carrying farther than any branch snap or distant animal movement could, filling the forest with a sense of mechanical inevitability. Leaves trembled subtly with each pulse, and small birds, normally alert to disturbance, remained strangely silent, their usual calls swallowed or ignored by the sound. Unlike other noises of the rainforest, which disperse rapidly among the foliage, this one maintained a clarity that suggested source and resonance in equal measure, a sonic footprint that no observer could ignore. The rhythm was neither chaotic nor random. It repeated, sometimes accelerating for a few seconds, then dropping into silence, only to resume in a pattern that defied any natural explanation. Among the layered canopy, leaves and dense undergrowth normally absorb sound, yet this noise seemed to float above the trees, unyielding and oddly coherent. Sunlight scattered through the branches, casting shifting patterns across the forest floor, yet none of the visual cues, fallen trunks, broken branches, or stirred soil, provided a clue to the source. Every footstep forward intensified the mystery, as the grinding neither approached nor receded in predictable ways. The dense vegetation, typically a barrier to sound, seemed to amplify it, as if the forest itself were conducting some invisible mechanism hidden beyond the eye's reach. Researchers moved cautiously through the undergrowth, triangulating with compasses and GPS, but the forest revealed no signs of machinery, vehicles, or human passage. No tracks marred the soil, no scraps of metal reflected sunlight, and no familiar scent of diesel or industrial residue indicated recent human activity. Their attempts to approach the source were confounded at every turn. The sound shifted subtly in direction, sometimes emerging from one side of the canopy, then the other, as though obeying an intelligence that defied conventional physics. The team's confusion grew, but so did a sense of urgent curiosity, compelling them to follow the auditory trail deeper into the unknown reaches of the Xingu Basin. Directional microphones captured the frequencies in surprising detail, revealing harmonics that suggested industrial processes, while decibel readings fluctuated unpredictably across the clearing. Analysis indicated vibrations reminiscent of metal grinding on a large scale, possibly gears or machinery operating beneath immense strain, yet the instruments detected no physical object generating these sounds. Attempts to simulate the sound through conventional means, small engines, steel scraping, or controlled impacts, failed, producing echoes that were inconsistent with the anomaly. Each test only reaffirmed that the source was both real and fundamentally inexplicable. Maps and satellite imagery confirmed the location within a protected reserve, where roads, mining, and industrial activity were forbidden, emphasizing the mystery of the sounds. The area had been catalogued extensively by environmental organizations, and historical records of prior expeditions noted the absence of roads or human infrastructure for decades. Satellite passes showed no disturbance, logging, or excavation, and the region remained one of the most inaccessible in the Amazon, protected both legally and geographically. The sound's presence here was not merely improbable, it was impossible by every measure known to the team. Indigenous elders recalled similar distant rumblings that echoed across the forest in previous decades, describing them as the work of unseen spirits or ancient craftsmen. Some stories spoke of low metallic vibrations that moved with the wind, while others warned that those who ventured too close risked disorientation or the inexplicable loss of time. When the researchers compared these oral accounts with their own observations, the parallels were striking. What modern instruments recorded as precise harmonic grinding had long been noted in human memory, suggesting a phenomenon that bridged both empirical observation and traditional knowledge. Even as recordings were replayed and analysed, the team debated whether the sounds reflected a natural acoustic anomaly, unknown mechanical activity, or something entirely beyond comprehension. Each playback revealed minute variations in tone and pitch, as if the source itself was not fixed but shifting imperceptibly in space or dimension. Experts in forest acoustics considered hypotheses ranging from distant landslides to subterranean mineral grinding, yet none could account for the rhythmic metallic quality that carried for hundreds of meters. The impossibility weighed on the researchers, a reminder that even the most thorough investigation could yield no certainty. Each pulse of the grinding threaded through the forest like a signal with no sender, and the intermittent pattern deepened both fascination and unease among the researchers. They began documenting every nuance, noting the time between pulses, the occasional modulation in tone, and the way it interacted with wind gusts and canopy density. Every attempt to trace it visually ended in frustration. The sound's origin seemed to shift in tandem with their own movement, eluding capture even with high-powered directional microphones and GPS correlation. By late afternoon, the team had mapped the anomaly's behaviour, but still lacked a single point of origin, leaving them to confront an unexplainable presence in the heart of the rainforest. By the time the team retraced its path toward the river, the sound had faded into the thick silence, yet its echo lingered in every shadow and in the rhythm of the wind through the canopy. The forest resumed its normal chorus of birds, insects, and distant water, but the memory of grinding persisted, imprinted on both instruments and human minds alike. Questions remained unanswered: whether the sound had a physical origin, an unseen mechanism, or an entirely unrecognized natural process. And though they returned to their base camp, every report, recording, and map would forever carry the trace of a mystery. The Amazon had not surrendered. Far into the forest, grinding carried on, a hidden industry that no instrument, record, or human eye could ever explain. The mirrored lake of Carajás. A dense fog had settled over the Carajás Plateau for days, thick enough to obscure the horizon and mute the usual morning chorus of birds. When the Carajás Basin expedition arrived at the lake, they began to notice subtle inconsistencies in the reflected landscape that defied explanation. At first, the water appeared like any other Amazonian lake, calm and shallow along the edges, with silty brown sediment typical of the region. But the reflection told a different story. hills seemed to rise where none existed, and small clearings appeared in the mirrored surface, devoid of any corresponding feature on the shore. The researchers paused, instruments in hand, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with maps, GPS coordinates, and their own memory of the surrounding terrain. Rays of sunlight filtering through the fog revealed shapes on the water that seemed familiar yet impossible, like a shadow of a world only half formed. Branches from nearby trees projected crisp, distorted silhouettes, and the subtle undulations of the water amplified inconsistencies, producing angles and slopes that the terrain could not possibly support. Birds moved along the shore, their reflections merging with phantom foliage, creating fleeting doubles that vanished if observed too closely. Even the ripples caused by a gentle wind seemed to respect the mirrored anomalies, weaving around impossible hills and clearing patches that were not there. In the Craios region, known for iron-rich plateaus and natural depressions forming seasonal lakes, geologists note that none of these should produce the exact mirrored distortions that drew the researchers' focus. Most lakes in the area exhibit murky brown water with diffuse reflections, scattered light, and ever-shifting sediment patterns. This lake, however, displayed an almost crystalline surface, holding every detail in unnerving sharpness. The visual effect was not a trick of light or perspective. Measurements confirmed that elevations and distances in the reflection simply did not correspond with reality. The team deployed GPS units and topographic scanners along the shore, painstakingly mapping every inch of land while photographing the reflection from multiple angles. Every hill and tree was catalogued, every shoreline curve recorded, yet the mirrored surface suggested elevations, contours, and openings that were not present. Notes were taken on every discrepancy, with sketches cross-referenced against maps, but each comparison only deepened the mystery. Attempts to mark positions with floating buoys failed to clarify the reflection, as the anomalies persisted and sometimes appeared to shift subtly with the movement of the observer. Drone surveys from above provided another layer of observation, recording topographic contours and canopy density, but no physical structures matched the ones emerging from the mirrored surface. Even three-dimensional mapping using LiDAR failed to capture the phantom hills and clearings, leaving empty forest where the lake displayed impossible geometry. The drones themselves seemed almost to hesitate over the lake, hovering longer than necessary, their cameras capturing repeated distortions in the water's mirrored features, as if the reflection operated under a different set of spatial rules. Water samples revealed no unusual chemical composition, and studies of sunlight reflection indicated that optical refraction could not account for the extra contours visible in the reflection. The surface tension, particulate matter, and dissolved minerals were all within expected Amazonian ranges. Light physics, which normally scatter across murky silt-laden waters, could not explain the inverted hills and phantom structures. The anomaly persisted under multiple angles of sunlight, cloud cover, and slight winds, defying every conventional understanding of reflection or optical illusion. Elders from nearby villages recounted stories of lakes that held alternative landscapes, warning that travelers who trusted the water's image could become disoriented or lost. Some spoke of places where the mirrored world seemed to anticipate human movement, shifting subtly when observers approached. The expedition documented these oral histories carefully, recognizing that local knowledge often contained details overlooked by conventional science, and in this case, it seemed to confirm the lake's anomalous nature. Reports from early 20th century explorers hinted at lakes in the region whose surfaces reflected phantom hills or structures never found on the shores, often archived in journals that went largely ignored by mainstream geographers. In some cases, expedition notes mentioned optical phenomena dismissed as mirages or tricks of light, yet the persistent accounts spanning decades suggested that certain lakes in the Courageous region had long been sites of visual anomalies. The researchers compared these historical accounts with their own photographs and LiDAR scans, finding a striking similarity in the shapes and placements of mirrored features. The team found themselves pausing mid-step, reluctant to approach the water, as if the reflection exerted a subtle gravity over perception itself. Distances seemed to warp, and some researchers instinctively stepped back when their feet were already near the shore. Conversations slowed, voices lowered, and notes became tentative. Even seasoned scientists admitted to feelings of vertigo or unease, unsure whether their eyes were deceiving them or if the lake truly contained a parallel, impossible landscape. As shadows lengthened and wind rustled the canopy, the mirrored hills and forested slopes sharpened, revealing angles and formations that defied topographic measurement. Every reflection became more precise, almost deliberate, with phantom clearings and structures that suggested design rather than random coincidence. The interplay of light, shadow, and water produced an effect that seemed impossible to document fully, leaving the researchers both awed and unnerved. Every image, every measurement, only hinted at the lake's deeper enigma. The lake preserved its impossible reflection silently, a world both familiar and foreign that refused to yield its secrets. The return to nowhere. The river seemed familiar at first, its bends and tributaries echoing the original expedition's charts, yet the Courageous Basin expedition soon noticed that no matter how far they travelled, landmarks appeared in the wrong sequence, as if the terrain itself had rewritten the path. Initially, they relied on memory and previous coordinates, trusting the maps drawn from the first expedition. But even the familiar tree clusters and river forks now betrayed subtle differences. Hills appeared slightly taller, meanders curved differently, and clearings emerged in places that should have been dense forest. Every step forward brought unease, the landscape both recognisably Amazonian and impossibly altered, forcing the team to question the reliability of their own observations. Trees that should have been clustered along narrow ridges now appeared isolated in open floodplain, while familiar clearings shifted subtly, creating a sense of déjà vu without explanation. The riverbanks themselves seemed to elongate or compress depending on the observer's approach, and smaller tributaries failed to match recorded paths. Occasionally, a familiar tree would be sighted in one location, only to reappear slightly downstream, as if the forest had folded upon itself. Each anomaly was small enough to be dismissed at first, but when repeated over hours and kilometres, it created a creeping disorientation that eroded confidence in conventional navigation. The seasonal floodwaters rose and fell as expected, yet the river current seemed to loop unusually, carrying boats past points that should have been dozens of kilometres downstream in the same hour. Amazon hydrology is governed by predictable patterns of rainfall, river discharge, and tidal influence, yet measurements showed inexplicable accelerations and delays. Eddy currents appeared in locations that contradicted the riverbed survey, and some channels deepened or disappeared in a matter of minutes, leaving sonar readings inconsistent with historical charts. The expedition began to suspect that either an unseen environmental factor was at play, or that the region itself was defying conventional physical mapping. Compasses spun with subtle hesitation, GPS devices logged conflicting coordinates, and sonar surveys of river depth revealed channels that vanished or doubled upon repeated measurement, defying conventional understanding of Amazonian topography. Even in areas where magnetic anomalies are common due to iron-rich soils, the instrument's behaviour was unprecedented. Field notes recorded moments when compasses completed full rotations in unison, or when GPS points plotted impossibly on the opposite bank. Each device, designed for precise measurement, instead became a tool that reinforced the impression of a landscape untethered from known reality. Charts were redrawn multiple times, but every attempt to reconcile physical reality with mapped routes produced contradictions, with some landmarks appearing twice and others missing entirely. Tributaries that should have led inland ended abruptly, then reappeared as minor streams downstream. Islands shifted in size and shape, and the pattern of sediment deposits suggested a river system that both existed and refused to exist according to conventional understanding. These inconsistencies forced the team to adopt a methodical, almost ritualized approach, mapping a segment, measuring coordinates, then retreating and verifying against previous data, only to find that no verification was ever complete. Logs from the original expedition noted days without observation or contact, vague descriptions of shifting terrain and repeated paths, all of which now seemed to manifest in the retracing team's journey. The 19-day disappearance, once considered a navigational error compounded by weather and fatigue, now takes on a more unsettling dimension. Maps marked with dashed lines and question marks suggested uncertainty in the original team's experience, and now those uncertainties were echoing in real time. The retracing expedition recognized that the environment had effectively incorporated the earlier mystery into the present, blurring the boundary between past and present journeys. The explorers began to hesitate at every fork, their confidence eroded by the uncanny repetition of landscapes and the impossibility of knowing which direction would finally lead them forward. Decisions that once would have been intuitive now required extended deliberation. Observers would pause at tree clusters that were both familiar and subtly different, while others would note that distant hills seemed to have shifted overnight. Even seasoned river navigators found themselves second-guessing their instincts, aware that every choice might circle them back to a point they believed already left behind. Indigenous knowledge suggested that certain parts of the Solomos floodplain could disorient travellers, but even those familiar with the river confessed that nothing in their experience matched the looping, contradictory paths the expedition now faced. Oral histories spoke of areas where the river itself seemed to have memory, leading wanderers to repeat journeys unknowingly. These warnings, once easily interpreted as cautionary tales for outsiders, now resonated with stark clarity. The retracing expedition began to perceive the floodplain as a place with a consciousness of its own, where geography and perception intertwined in unpredictable ways. An uneasy silence settled over the team as they recognized patterns in the forest and river that mimic the past yet refuse to resolve into coherent geography, leaving them suspended between memory and perception. Each measurement reinforced the sense of impermanence, as if the landscape were responsive to their presence. Tension grew in small increments, a misjudged step on soft mud, a suddenly shifted branch, the echo of their own voices bouncing off invisible features. It became impossible to distinguish between physical reality and mental projection, with the forest and river maintaining a quiet dominion over both. As the sun began to lower behind distant plateaus, shadows stretched across channels and ridges in ways that further warped the sense of direction, and every measured coordinate only deepened the enigma of the erased 19 days. The expedition had followed the river faithfully, retraced known paths meticulously, and yet the terrain insisted on being unknowable. Every horizon promised continuity while simultaneously denying it, leaving the team caught in a state of careful observation and creeping doubt. They realized with a quiet dread that the forest had guided them back to a place that had never existed on any map.